The iron gates loomed before her like the entrance to salvation or damnation. Grace couldn't tell which anymore. Snow bit at her cheeks as the wind howled across the Montana plains, and her fingers, numb inside threadbare gloves, could barely grip her single carpetbag. Behind those gates stood warmth, shelter, perhaps mercy. Behind her lay only the brutal certainty of a winter that devoured the weak. When the ranch foreman had found her collapsed against the fence post that morning, half frozen and delirious, she'd heard him mutter something about the boss being a hard man, but not a cruel one. Now, standing in a lamplit study that smelled of leather and wood smoke, facing Jonathan Hale, a man whose eyes held all the warmth of a February storm, Grace understood the difference between charity and transaction. "I need a mother for my sons," he said, his voice flat as the plains outside. "You need shelter. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Whitfield. Not love, not companionship. A practical arrangement. You'll have a roof, food, and protection. My boys will have stability. Do we have an understanding?" Grace's throat tightened. Pride screamed at her to refuse, to walk back into that killing cold with her dignity intact. But survival whispered a different truth. If you want to know whether desperation can become something more, whether a bargain struck in winter can bloom into spring, stay with me until the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The trouble had started 3 weeks earlier, though Grace would later realize the seeds had been planted long before that. Timber Falls wasn't much of a town, just a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the Montana wilderness like frightened children seeking warmth. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a one-room structure that leaked when it rained and creaked in the wind like an old woman's bones. Grace had taught there for 2 years, pouring everything she had into lessons for children whose futures seemed as fixed as the mountains on the horizon. She'd believed in the power of education the way some people believed in divine providence. Every child deserved a chance to rise above their circumstances, to see beyond the narrow confines of survival. That belief had sustained her through meager wages, through lonely evenings in her rented room above the general store, through the whispers that followed a young unmarried woman who lived alone. Then came the incident with Thomas Garrett. Thomas was 14, broad-shouldered from ranch work, with his father's quick temper and his mother's desperate hope that education might save him from a life of brutal labor. He'd been struggling with arithmetic when Silas Garrett, the boy's father and one of the town's most influential ranchers, had stormed into the schoolhouse one afternoon. "You putting ideas in my boy's head?" Silas had demanded, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. "Telling him he's too good for honest work?" Grace had stood her ground, heart hammering. "I'm teaching him mathematics, Mr. Garrett, skills that will serve him whether he works with cattle or calculations." "He don't need calculations, he needs to learn his place." Silas had grabbed his son's arm, yanking him from his desk. "You stay away from my boy with your fancy notions, Miss Whitfield. Women like you are poison to decent folk." The confrontation had lasted mere minutes, but its consequences rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. Within a week, 3 other families had withdrawn their children. Within 2, the school board, comprised largely of men who drank with Silas Garrett, had called a meeting. Grace had known before she entered that room what verdict they'd reached. She'd seen it in the way Mrs. Patterson averted her eyes at church, and how Mr. Chen at the general store had suddenly remembered debts she supposedly owed. "Your teaching methods have proven divisive," Edgar Morrison, the board chairman, had said, not meeting her gaze. "And given your unmarried status, there are concerns about propriety. The board has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." "Immediately?" The word had come out as a whisper. "But Mr. Morrison, the school year. We've already secured a replacement, Mr. Hargrove's nephew from back east." Morrison had finally looked at her then, and Grace saw not cruelty but cowardice in his eyes. "You'll need to vacate your room by week's end. Mrs. Patterson requires it for her sister." Just like that, her life had unraveled. No position, no home, no character reference that would secure her another teaching post. And winter settling over the territory like a judge's gavel. Grace had spent 3 days searching for alternatives. She'd offered to work at the general store. Mr. Chen had hemmed and hawed before admitting his wife wouldn't stand for it. The hotel had no openings. The boarding house was full. The saloon owner had made an offer that turned her stomach. You could try the ranches, Mr. Chen had suggested quietly when she'd come to settle her account. Some of them hire domestic help, cooking, cleaning. The pay ain't much, but it includes room and board. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all she had. Grace had packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, a worn coat, her mother's Bible, and the books she'd accumulated over the years, into a carpetbag that had seen better days. She'd left Timber Falls on foot, unable to afford even the stagecoach fare, following the rutted road that wound between the ranches dotting the valley. The first ranch she'd tried was the Hendersons. Mrs. Henderson had been kind but firm. "I do my own housework, dear, and my husband, well, he wouldn't stand for another woman under our roof, you understand." The second ranch belonged to a bachelor who'd looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl. She'd left before he could finish his proposition. By the third day, desperation had set in alongside the cold. The temperature had dropped and storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark prophecy. Grace's inadequate coat offered little protection, and her worn boots let in moisture with every step. She'd finished the last of her bread that morning, and her canteen was nearly empty. That's when she'd seen the gates. They were impressive. Wrought iron with an H worked into the design, set in stone pillars that spoke of wealth and permanence. A sign proclaimed, "Hale Ranch, private property." Beyond the gates, a road wound through snow-dusted grassland toward distant buildings that shimmered like a mirage. Grace had pressed on, reasoning that a large ranch might need workers. But the wind had picked up, driving snow into her face, and the cold that had been merely uncomfortable became dangerous. Her legs grew heavy, her thoughts slow and confused. She'd stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. The fence post had appeared like a gift. Grace had leaned against it, just for a moment's rest, and felt the insidious warmth of hypothermia creeping through her limbs. Her eyes had drifted shut. She'd dreamed of summer afternoons in her childhood garden, of her mother's voice singing lullabies, of warmth and safety and home. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" The voice had dragged her back to consciousness. Grace had opened her eyes to find a weathered face peering down at her, a man in his 50s with concerned eyes and a thick coat. "Lord have mercy, you're half frozen." He'd pulled her upright with surprising gentleness. "What in blazes are you doing out here in this weather?" I was looking for work." Her voice had sounded strange, slurred. "Housekeeping, cooking. I can teach reading, too." "Can't help you there, but I can't leave you to freeze either. Come on, let's get you to the house. Boss might have some ideas." The man, he'd introduced himself as Charlie, the ranch foreman, had half carried her through the gates and down that long road. Grace had retained only scattered impressions. The massive barn, the bunkhouse where men paused in their work to stare, the main house looming larger as they approached. The house was impressive, built of stone and timber in a style that suggested both strength and permanence. It was far larger than anything Grace had expected, with multiple wings and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, promising warmth. Charlie had brought her through a side entrance into a mudroom, then through to a kitchen where a stout woman with flour on her apron looked up in surprise. "Charlie, what on earth—" "Found her collapsed at the gate, Mrs. Brennan. She's near frozen. I need to fetch the boss." The woman, the housekeeper, Grace realized, had clicked her tongue and immediately set about warming cider, wrapping Grace in a blanket and scolding her in that particular way that conveyed care through criticism. "Foolish girl, wandering about in weather like this. What were you thinking? Here, drink this slowly." "Slowly. You'll make yourself sick gulping it down. Charlie, she needs to see the boss immediately. She's in no shape to travel." Then had come the wait. Grace had sat in that warm kitchen, feeling slowly returning to her extremities, while Mrs. Brennan bustled about and cast concerned glances her way. Through an interior door she could hear the sounds of children, boys from the pitch of their voices, and a deeper voice responding. "Papa, can we go riding tomorrow?" "If the weather clears, Caleb." "You always say that." "Because it's always true. Now finish your arithmetic." "I hate arithmetic." Nevertheless. The exchange was so ordinary, so domestic, that it made Grace's heart ache. This was what she'd lost. Not just employment and shelter, but the daily rhythms of family life. of children learning and growing, of belonging somewhere. Charlie had returned, slightly out of breath. Boss says to bring her to his study. Can you walk, miss? Grace had nodded, though her legs trembled with more than cold. She'd followed Charlie through hallways that smelled of beeswax and wood polish, past rooms furnished with an odd combination of expensive pieces and conspicuous gaps, as if someone had started decorating and then simply stopped caring. The study was lined with books, warmed by a crackling fire, and dominated by a large desk. Behind that desk sat Jonathan Hale. Grace's first thought was that he looked like the land itself, hard, weathered, unforgiving. He was perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair showing the first touches of gray at the temples, and eyes that were startlingly blue in a face tanned by sun and wind. He was handsome in the way a cliff face is handsome, all sharp planes and stern lines. He'd looked up from the papers before him, and Grace had felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. This was a man who missed nothing, who calculated and assessed and judged. Miss Whitfield, Grace Whitfield. She'd tried to stand straight, to present herself with some dignity despite her bedraggled state. I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. Hale. I was seeking employment when the weather turned. I'm a teacher by training, but I can keep house, cook. You're the schoolteacher from Timber Falls. It wasn't a question. Grace had felt her stomach drop. You know of me? I make it my business to know what happens in this valley. I know Edgar Morrison dismissed you. I know why. His expression hadn't changed, revealing nothing of what he thought about that. Sit down before you fall down, Miss Whitfield. She'd sunk into the leather chair facing his desk, grateful despite herself. You have no family? Jonathan had asked. My parents are deceased. I have no siblings. No prospects? Grace had lifted her chin. If I had prospects, sir, I wouldn't have been collapsing against your fence. Something might have flickered in those blue eyes. Amusement? Respect? But it was gone too quickly to identify. Fair enough. Charlie says you were asking about work. Yes, I'm willing to do whatever needs doing. I'm a hard worker, Mr. Hale, and I learn quickly. I'm sure you are. He'd leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. However, I already have a housekeeper, and my ranch hands are chosen from men who've worked cattle all their lives. I have no position to offer you. The words had landed like blows. Grace had felt the last vestiges of hope crumbling. I understand. If you could perhaps spare some provisions, I'll be on my way. I wasn't finished. His voice had cut through her words cleanly. I said I have no position to offer you. However, I have a different proposal. And then he'd said those words that would change everything. I need a mother for my sons. You need shelter. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Whitfield. Not love. Not companionship. A practical arrangement. You'll have a roof, food, and protection. My boys will have stability. Do we have an understanding? Grace had stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I beg your pardon? You heard me correctly. Jonathan had risen from his chair and moved to stand by the fire, his profile outlined by flames. My wife died 3 years ago, shortly after our younger son was born. I've managed since then with Mrs. Brennan's help, but the boys need more than a housekeeper can provide. They need a mother's influence. Eli, my oldest, is 7 and too serious for his age. Caleb is 3 and doesn't remember his mother at all. Mr. Hale, I appreciate your concern, but surely you can't be serious. We're strangers. You know nothing about me beyond whatever gossip. I know you stood up to Silas Garrett on principle, even though it cost you everything. He'd turned to face her fully. I know you're educated, which means you can teach my sons properly. I know you're desperate enough to have walked into a storm, which means you understand survival. And I know you're here, which means you have no other options. The brutal honesty of it had stolen her breath. This isn't a romantic notion, Miss Whitfield. It's a business arrangement. You'll have your own room, naturally. You'll be expected to take charge of the household, to mother my children, to appear as my wife in public. In return, you'll have security, comfort, and my name. You'll never want for anything material. And you? Grace had asked, finding her voice. What do you gain beyond someone to raise your children? Stability, routine, the appearance of a normal household, which benefits my sons. And I'll be honest, It will silence the widows and daughters who circle every time I go to town. I have no interest in remarrying for love, Miss Whitfield. I loved my wife. That chapter of my life is closed. The way he'd said it, so flat, so final, had told Grace everything she needed to know about Jonathan Hale's heart. It was as closed as his gates, as remote as the mountains. "This is insane," she'd whispered. "This is practical. You're an educated woman with nowhere to go and winter setting in. I'm a widower with 2 sons and a house that needs a mistress. We can help each other." Grace had looked at him, this stranger who'd proposed a loveless marriage with less emotion than most people ordered breakfast. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, foolish. But the alternative was death. Slow death by starvation or quick death by cold. Those were her options outside these walls. "If I agree," she'd said slowly, "what are your terms?" Jonathan had nodded, as if her capitulation had never been in doubt. "You'll commit to 1 year minimum. That gives the boys time to adjust and gives us both time to determine if the arrangement is sustainable. After a year, if either of us wishes to end it, I'll provide you with funds sufficient to establish yourself elsewhere, a year's wages for a teacher, and a letter of reference. If we decide to continue, the marriage remains indefinitely. And if I want to leave before the year is up? You're free to go at any time, but the financial arrangement only applies after the full year." So she'd be trapped, at least for 12 months, but trapped in warmth and safety, with food and shelter, trapped the way a bird was trapped in a cage, confined, but alive. "Your sons," Grace had said, "tell me about them." For the first time, something genuinely human had crossed Jonathan's face. Not warmth exactly, but a softening around the eyes. "Eli is brilliant, too intelligent for his own good sometimes. He's been the man of the house since his mother died, or tries to be. He needs to learn how to be a child again. Caleb is pure light, curious, affectionate, exhausting. He needs consistency and patience." And they would accept me? A stranger suddenly thrust into their lives as their mother? Children are adaptable. And you're a teacher. You know how to win young hearts. Did she? Grace had won her students' minds, certainly, but their hearts had belonged to their families. What did she know about being a mother? But then, what choice did she have? "I want your word," she'd said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice, "that you'll never raise a hand to me, that I'll be treated with respect, regardless of the nature of our arrangement." Jonathan had met her eyes directly. "You have my word. I'm not a gentleman, Miss Whitfield, but I'm not a brute. And the boys, I'll need your support in raising them. I can't be undermined in front of them." "Agreed. In matters of the children, we present a united front." "One more thing." Grace had taken a deep breath. "My books. I have a small collection. I'd like to keep them." "Of course. The house has a library. You're welcome to it." The practicality of negotiating terms for such an arrangement struck Grace as absurd, even as she participated in it. But perhaps that practicality was the only thing making it possible. "When?" she'd asked. "The circuit judge comes through in 3 days. We'll marry then. Until that time, Mrs. Brennan will prepare a room for you, and you'll take your meals with the family. The boys should meet you before the wedding." "Mr. Hale." Jonathan. The name felt strange on her tongue. "You understand this is mad?" "I understand it's necessary." He'd extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" Grace had looked at that hand, large, calloused, completely steady. The hand of a man who'd never doubted himself, who'd built an empire through will and work. If she took it, she'd be committing to a path that terrified her. If she didn't, she'd be walking back into that storm. She'd thought of her students' faces, bright with learning, of her mother's voice. "Survive, Grace. Whatever it takes, survive." She'd taken his hand. "We have an agreement." Mrs. Brennan had shown Grace to a guest room on the 2nd floor, clucking over her the entire way. "Bath first, then food, then rest. Don't you argue with me, girl. I've seen drowned rats in better condition." The room was simple but comfortable. A bed with a thick quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window that looked out over snowy fields. Mrs. Brennan had returned with warm water, soap that smelled of lavender, and a flannel nightgown. This was Mrs. Hale's, the housekeeper had said quietly. The master keeps her things in storage, but she'd want them used. She was practical that way. Grace had wanted to refuse, to say she couldn't wear a dead woman's clothes, but practicality won out. She'd bathed quickly, washing away the grime of 3 days' travel, and slipped into the nightgown. It was too long, but warm and soft. When Mrs. Brennan returned with a tray of stew and bread, Grace had asked the question burning in her mind. What was she like? Mrs. Hale? The housekeeper had settled into a chair with a sigh. Sarah, she was sunshine itself, bright and warm and full of life. She made this house a home. The master, well, he was different with her, softer. They were deeply in love. Anyone could see it. What happened to her? The baby, Caleb, was a difficult birth. There were complications. She hemorrhaged. The doctor tried everything, but Mrs. Brennan had wiped her eyes. The master blamed himself, though there was nothing he could have done. He shut down after that, threw himself into work, pushed everyone away. The house has been just a building since. Grace had absorbed this, understanding now the blankness in Jonathan's eyes. He wasn't cold by nature. He was frozen by grief. The boys, she'd prompted. Sweet children, both of them. Eli took Sarah's death hard, became serious overnight, like he had to be strong for his papa and brother. Caleb. He's never known a mother's love, Mrs. Brennan's not his mother, much as I care for him. And they're expecting me to be? The housekeeper had given her a searching look. The master told me about your arrangement. Unusual, yes, but not unheard of. These are hard lands, Miss Whitfield. People do what they must to survive. The question isn't whether this is conventional. It's whether you're strong enough to make it work. I don't know, Grace had admitted. Well, then, you'll find out. Mrs. Brennan had stood, collecting the empty tray. Get some sleep. Tomorrow you'll meet the boys. Children have a way of sorting truth from lies quickly. They'll know if you're genuine. That thought had kept Grace awake long into the night. Morning came too soon and too bright, sunlight streaming through windows onto snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds. Grace had dressed in her better of two dresses, still worn but clean and mended, and tried to tame her dark hair into something presentable. Breakfast was served in a dining room that could have seated 20 but held only 4 place settings. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper. 2 boys sat on either side. The older one, Eli, watched her approach with eyes that were too knowing for 7 years. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's face, from what Grace could glimpse in the portrait hanging over the fireplace. The younger one, Caleb, squirmed in his chair, curiosity written plainly on his round face. Boys, Jonathan said without looking up from his paper. This is Miss Whitfield. Miss Whitfield, my sons Eli and Caleb. Hello, Grace said, taking the seat Mrs. Brennan indicated. It's very nice to meet you both. Eli said nothing, but his gaze never wavered. Caleb, however, burst out with, Are you going to be our new mama? Caleb, Jonathan's voice held a warning. But Papa said, I know what Papa said. Let Miss Whitfield eat her breakfast. It was, Grace thought, possibly the most awkward meal of her life. She tried to make conversation, asking about their lessons, their interests, their favorite activities. Caleb chattered freely about horses and his dog and the kittens in the barn. Eli answered in monosyllables when he answered at all. After breakfast, Jonathan stood. I have business to attend to. Miss Whitfield, you should familiarize yourself with the house and grounds. Eli will show you around. He left before Grace could protest. Eli regarded her with that too serious expression. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Show me around. I don't mind. Yes, you do. You'd rather be anywhere but here. The accuracy of that hit hard. Grace knelt to his level. You're right. This is strange and uncomfortable, and I don't know what I'm doing. But your father has offered me shelter, and I've accepted. I understand that's difficult for you. Why do we need a new mother? We were fine before. Were you? Grace asked gently. Something cracked in Eli's expression. Pain, longing, grief compressed into a 7-year-old frame. I take care of Caleb. I don't need help. I'm sure you do a wonderful job. But Eli, you're 7 years old. You should be playing and learning and being a child. You shouldn't have to be the grown-up. Someone has to be. The words broke her heart. Grace reached out, then hesitated. "May I?" After a long moment, Eli nodded. Grace drew him into a gentle embrace, feeling him tremor with the effort of not crying. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," she whispered. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. But perhaps I can help carry some of the weight you've been holding." When Eli finally pulled back, his eyes were wet, but his expression had softened slightly. "You really don't know what you're doing, do you?" "Not even a little bit," Grace admitted. "Okay," Eli straightened. "I'll show you around, but don't expect me to like you right away." "Fair enough." The house tour revealed the contradictions Mrs. Brennan had hinted at. Beautiful rooms left empty. A nursery frozen in time. A master bedroom kept locked. Spaces that should have hummed with life, instead echoing with absence. But there were also hopeful signs. The kitchen where Mrs. Brennan ruled with warm efficiency. The library stocked with books in multiple languages. The music room with a piano that only needed tuning. And there were the boys' rooms. Eli's was neat to the point of obsessive, with books arranged by height and toys barely touched. Caleb's was chaos incarnate, with drawings pinned to every surface and toys everywhere. "He's messy," Eli said, almost apologetically. "He's 3, Grace replied. Messiness is practically a requirement. That earned her the ghost of a smile. By lunchtime, Grace had a better sense of the household. Mrs. Brennan managed the day-to-day operations with help from 2 girls from town. The ranch employed a dozen hands, most of whom lived in the bunkhouse. Charlie, the foreman, essentially ran the operation while Jonathan managed the business side. It was a well-ordered machine that needed no additional parts. And yet here she was, being grafted onto it like a foreign branch. That evening, after the boys were in bed, Jonathan summoned her back to his study. "The judge arrives day after tomorrow," he said without preamble. "I've arranged for the ceremony to take place here, small, just Mrs. Brennan and Charlie as witnesses. No guests, no celebration. This isn't that kind of wedding." His tone was matter of fact. "We'll sign the legal documents, exchange the necessary words, and continue on. I see no reason for pageantry." Grace felt something shrivel inside her. Not that she'd expected a love match, but the sheer coldness of it stung. "Of course. Practical." "Precisely." He pulled out a document. "I've had papers drawn up outlining our agreement. I want everything in writing to protect us both." She read through the contract, finding it thorough if impersonal. It specified her duties, the financial arrangements, the dissolution terms. It was a business document, nothing more. "There's one more thing," Jonathan said, pulling a small box from his desk drawer. "This was my mother's." Inside the box lay a simple gold band. "You don't have to wear it if—" "No," Grace interrupted. "I'll wear it. If I'm to play this role, I should look the part." She slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, spinning loosely. Jonathan noticed. "I'll have it sized after the ceremony." "It's fine." Grace stood, suddenly exhausted. "Is there anything else?" "Just one thing." Jonathan's expression was unreadable. "Once we're married, in public, we must appear united. The boys need stability. The community needs to believe this is legitimate." "You mean I need to pretend to be in love with you?" "I mean we need to appear to be a functional married couple. There's a difference." "Is there?" For a moment their eyes met and held. Grace saw something flicker in his gaze, recognition, perhaps, of the difficulty of what they were attempting. But it vanished quickly. "Get some rest, Miss Whitfield. In 2 days, you'll be Mrs. Hale. Best to be prepared." As Grace climbed the stairs to her room, she couldn't help but think that no amount of preparation could ready her for the strange life she was about to enter. She was agreeing to become wife, mother, and mistress of a household, all to a man who'd made clear his heart was buried with his first love. But outside, the wind howled and snow fell, and Grace knew that sometimes survival required impossible bargains. Tomorrow, she would meet the boys again. The day after, she would become their mother and Jonathan Hale's wife. The day after that, she would begin learning whether she'd made the wisest or most foolish decision of her life. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and clear, the kind of crystalline winter day that made everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Grace woke before sunrise, her stomach churning with anxiety that no amount of deep breathing could settle. In a few hours, she would legally bind herself to a man she'd known for less than 3 days. would promise to mother children who were still strangers, would step into a role she had no idea how to fill. Mrs. Brennan arrived with breakfast on a tray and a dress draped over her arm. "Couldn't have you getting married in that worn thing you've been wearing," the housekeeper said briskly, though her eyes were kind. "This was Sarah's, too. She wore it to town functions. It should fit you well enough." The dress was beautiful, deep blue wool with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, well made and carefully preserved. Grace ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the weight of what she was inheriting. Not just clothes, but an entire life. "She wouldn't have minded," Mrs. Brennan said quietly, reading Grace's hesitation. Sarah wasn't the jealous type. She'd want her things used, not locked away gathering dust. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. After Mrs. Brennan left, she forced down a few bites of toast and dressed with trembling hands. The dress fit reasonably well, perhaps a bit loose in the waist, but nothing scandalous. She arranged her hair as best she could, pinching her cheeks to bring some color to her pale face. The ceremony was to take place in Jonathan's study at 10 o'clock. Grace descended the stairs at a quarter till, her legs unsteady. She could hear voices from below, Jonathan's deep rumble, Mrs. Brennan's warmer tones, and a stranger's gravelly drawl that must belong to the judge. At the landing, she paused. Through the window, she could see the ranch spread out below, vast and snow-covered and utterly foreign. This would be her home now. These would be her people. This strange, grief-haunted house would be the only shelter between her and a hostile world. She could still leave, could walk out that door and take her chances elsewhere. Jonathan had said she was free to go at any time. But where would she go, and how long would she survive? Grace continued down the stairs. The study had been rearranged slightly, the furniture pushed back to create a small ceremonial space. Judge Whitcomb stood by the fire, a portly man in his 60s with shrewd eyes and an expression that suggested he'd seen everything and been surprised by none of it. Mrs. Brennan waited near the door, dabbing at her eyes. Charlie stood beside her, uncomfortable in clean clothes. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, dressed in a dark suit that made him look even more formidable. When Grace entered, his gaze swept over her once, clinically assessing, before he nodded. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Hale." "Well then," Judge Whitcomb said, pulling out a small book. "Shall we proceed? I understand this is to be a brief ceremony." "The briefest possible," Jonathan confirmed. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He'd probably married dozens of couples over the years, some for love, some for land, some for reasons far stranger than this. He opened his book and began to read in a practiced monotone. Grace heard the words as if from a great distance. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." How many times had she imagined her wedding day as a girl? It had always been in a church, with flowers and music, and a man who looked at her like she hung the moon. Instead, she was in a study, wearing a dead woman's dress, marrying a man who'd made clear he wanted a housekeeper, not a wife. "Jonathan Ezekiel Hale, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Jonathan's voice was steady, empty of inflection. "Grace Ann Whitfield, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was it. Her last chance to refuse, to run, to choose pride over survival. "I do," Grace heard herself say. "The ring?" Jonathan pulled out his mother's ring, the band they'd examined 2 nights before. He took Grace's left hand. She noticed his touch was impersonal, almost clinical, and slid the ring onto her finger. It still spun loosely, and she curled her fingers to keep it from falling off. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Whitcomb snapped his book shut. "You may kiss the bride if you're so inclined." Grace's eyes flew to Jonathan's face. They hadn't discussed this. He looked equally caught off guard, a muscle twitching in his jaw. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Jonathan leaned forward and pressed a brief perfunctory kiss to her forehead. "Congratulations," the judge said dryly. "Mrs. Brennan, would you and Charlie sign as witnesses?" The paperwork was completed quickly. Judge Whitcomb accepted payment, declined an invitation to lunch, and departed, leaving Grace standing in the study as Mrs. Jonathan Hale. The name felt as foreign as the ring on her finger. Papa, is it done? Is Miss Whitfield our mama now?" Caleb burst into the study, Eli following more slowly behind. The younger boy's face was alight with excitement, while Eli's expression remained carefully neutral. "Yes, Caleb," Jonathan said. "Miss Whitfield is now Mrs. Hale, your new mother." "Can I call you Mama?" Caleb asked, bouncing on his toes. The question hit Grace squarely in the chest. "If you'd like to," she managed. "I'd like to." Caleb threw his arms around her waist, hugging tight. "I have a mama now, just like other boys." Over his head, Grace met Eli's eyes. The older boy stood apart, watching this scene with an expression she couldn't decipher. After a moment, he turned and walked out. "Eli," Jonathan's voice was sharp. "Come back here." "Let him go," Grace said quietly. "This is difficult for him. He needs to learn proper manners. He needs time." Grace gently disentangled herself from Caleb. "I'll speak with him later." Jonathan looked like he wanted to argue, but Mrs. Brennan cleared her throat. "Lunch is ready, if everyone's hungry. I've prepared something special for the occasion." The meal was strained despite Mrs. Brennan's efforts. Caleb chattered constantly, asking Grace questions about everything from her favorite color to whether she knew how to ride a horse. Jonathan ate in silence, responding when directly addressed but offering nothing voluntary. Eli picked at his food and refused to meet anyone's eyes. After lunch, Jonathan stood. "I have work to attend to. Mrs. Hale, perhaps you should begin settling into your new role." He said the name without emphasis, as if testing how it sounded. Then he was gone, leaving Grace alone with the reality of what she'd done. Mrs. Brennan found her in the parlor an hour later, staring out the window at the snow-covered fields. "Second thoughts already?" "Third and fourth thoughts, too," Grace admitted. "Mrs. Brennan, I haven't the faintest idea what I'm supposed to do now. You're supposed to be a wife and mother, which means you figure it out as you go along, same as everyone else." The housekeeper settled into a chair with her mending basket. "The master's moved your things to the mistress's chambers." Grace's head snapped around. "What?" "But he said I'd have my own room. He said this wasn't appearances, girl. The household staff will talk, and talk travels. You're married now. You share rooms, even if you don't share a bed." Mrs. Brennan's expression softened. "There's a sitting room attached with a daybed. Very comfortable. Many married couples keep separate sleeping arrangements for various reasons. No one need know the details." The mistress's chambers. Sarah's rooms. Grace felt like an intruder, a fraud wearing a dead woman's dress and living her life. "I'll show you," Mrs. Brennan said, rising. "Best to face it head on." The chambers were on the second floor, connected to the master bedroom by a shared sitting room. Sarah's presence was everywhere, in the delicate wallpaper, in the brushes still arranged on the vanity, in the faint scent of lavender that clung to the curtains. The bedroom itself was beautiful, with a large four-poster bed and windows that overlooked the ranch. "The master hasn't changed anything," Mrs. Brennan said quietly. "Couldn't bear to, I think. But that means it's yours to alter as you see fit. Make it your own, Mrs. Hale." Mrs. Hale. Grace would have to get used to that name. Her meager possessions looked pathetic in the large wardrobe. 2 worn dresses, some underthings, her mother's Bible, and her small collection of books. The contrast between her poverty and the room's elegance was almost painful. "The master said you are to use Sarah's things," Mrs. Brennan continued. "The dresses will need altering, but there's plenty of fabric. And there's household money for anything you need. You're the mistress here now. You can order what you require." The idea of ordering anything, of having that authority, felt presumptuous. Grace had spent her adult life making do with almost nothing. Now she supposedly commanded a household. "Where's Eli?" she asked. "Likely in the barn. He goes there when he's upset. Has a favorite horse he talks to." Grace nodded. "I should speak with him." "Give him space first. The boy's processing. You've turned his world upside down." But Grace couldn't settle. She wandered the house, familiarizing herself with rooms she'd only glimpsed during yesterday's tour. The dining room with its long table, the parlor with its fine furniture, the music room with the piano that beckoned, the library that took her breath away, walls of books, a rolling ladder, comfortable chairs positioned to catch the light. She pulled a volume at random, Shakespeare's sonnets, and was immediately lost. How long had it been since she'd read for pleasure? Teaching left little time for her own education. She curled into one of the leather chairs, intending to read just a page or two, and surfaced an hour later to find Caleb watching her from the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading. Do you like stories?" Caleb's face lit up. "Mrs. Brennan tells me stories sometimes, about princes and dragons. Would you like me to read to you?" He nodded eagerly and climbed into her lap without hesitation. Grace's heart squeezed. This child, who'd never known a mother, accepted affection as naturally as breathing. She found a collection of fairy tales and began to read, adjusting her voice for different characters, making Caleb giggle with her dragon roar. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice Eli had entered until Caleb called out, "Eli, come listen, Mama's reading about knights." Eli froze in the doorway. "She's not our mama." "Yes, she is. Papa said she's our new mother. That's different." Eli's voice was tight with emotion. "Our real mama is dead." "Eli," Grace said gently, "you're absolutely right. I'm not your real mother. I could never replace her." The boy blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. "But I'm here now," Grace continued, "and I'd very much like to be your friend if you'll let me. Friends don't replace other friends. They just add to them." "I don't need a friend," Eli said, but his voice wavered. "Everyone needs friends. Even serious 7-year-olds who think they have to be grown-ups." Grace held his gaze. "I know you've been strong for a long time, Eli. I know you've been taking care of things, but maybe, just maybe, you could let someone else help carry the load." Eli's face crumpled. For a moment, Grace thought he might cry. Instead, he spun and ran from the room. Caleb looked up at her with worried eyes. "Eli's sad a lot." "I know, sweetheart. Will you make him happy?" "I'll certainly try." That evening, dinner was another strained affair. Jonathan barely spoke. Eli refused to look at anyone, and even Caleb's chatter seemed forced. Grace attempted conversation several times before giving up. After the meal, Jonathan announced he had paperwork and disappeared into his study. Mrs. Brennan shooed Grace away when she tried to help with dishes. "You're the mistress now. You don't do dishes." So Grace found herself alone in the parlor, feeling utterly useless. She was married, a mother of 2, mistress of a large household, and she had absolutely no idea what any of that meant or how to do it. She was still sitting there, staring into the fire, when Jonathan emerged from his study around 9 o'clock. He paused when he saw her. "You're still awake." I don't seem to be sleepy." "First day as Mrs. Hale too overwhelming?" "Something like that." Grace straightened. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "What exactly do you expect of me? Day to day, I mean. Mrs. Brennan runs the household beautifully. The boys have a routine. I feel rather superfluous." Jonathan considered this. "You're meant to be their mother. That goes beyond routine. It's about connection, guidance, emotional support. Things you believe can be contracted for. Things that benefit the boys, regardless of how the arrangement came about." He poured himself a whiskey. "Mrs. Hale, I'm not under any illusions about what this is, but my sons deserve better than a father who's too broken to give them what they need. You can provide that." "And what about what I need?" The question hung in the air between them. Jonathan's expression remained impassive. "You need shelter, security, and purpose. I'm providing all 3. Was there something else you required?" "Yes," Grace wanted to say. "Kindness, warmth, the possibility of more than this cold transaction. But she'd agreed to these terms. She'd signed the papers. She'd said the vows." "No," she said quietly. "Nothing else." "Good. Then I'll bid you good night." He started toward his room, then paused. "The boys, they'll adjust. Give them time." After he left, Grace remained by the fire for another hour before finally climbing the stairs to her new chambers. The room felt cavernous and empty, despite its elegant furnishings. She changed into her nightgown, climbed into the large bed, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, Jonathan slept in his own room. Down the hall, 2 boys dreamed whatever dreams filled the heads of grieving children. Beyond the walls, snow fell silently over the ranch, covering everything in white. And Grace lay awake, wondering if she'd traded one kind of death for another. The next morning brought a hard lesson in household management. Mrs. Brennan arrived after breakfast with a list of items that needed ordering, questions about menu planning, and a schedule of household tasks requiring the mistress's approval. Grace stared at the papers, overwhelmed. I don't know anything about running a household this size, she admitted. Then you'll learn. Sarah had to learn too, and she'd grown up on a ranch. You'll manage. Mrs. Brennan's tone was brisk, but not unkind. For now, just make decisions. They don't have to be perfect. They just have to be made. So Grace began. She approved menus, though she had little sense of how much food a ranch household consumed. She reviewed supply lists, checking items she hoped were correct. She made decisions about laundry schedules and cleaning rotations, praying she wasn't disrupting a system that already worked. By mid-morning, her head ached, and she desperately wanted to escape. She found the boys in the parlor with their tutors, a prim woman named Miss Davies, who came 3 times a week. Both boys looked bored senseless. "How are the lessons going?" Grace asked. Miss Davies smiled tightly. "Well enough, Mrs. Hale. Young Caleb struggles with focus, but that's to be expected at his age." Grace watched as Eli worked through arithmetic problems with mechanical precision, no engagement or curiosity in his face. "May I see what they're studying?" The material was dull as dust, rote memorization, repetitive exercises, nothing to spark wonder or imagination. Grace's teaching instinct stirred. "Miss Davies, might I borrow the boys for the afternoon? I'd like to assess their progress myself." The tutor looked affronted but could hardly refuse. After she left, Grace sat down with the boys. "What do you actually enjoy learning about?" Caleb immediately said, "Horses." Eli was more cautious. "I like reading about other places, countries far away." "Excellent. Then this afternoon we're going to learn about Mongolia. They have amazing horses there, Caleb, and a whole empire built on horseback. Eli, we'll read about their trade routes and conquests, and we'll do it all in the library, which is far more interesting than this parlor." For the first time since she'd arrived, Eli looked intrigued. "Papa won't mind? I'm your mother now. I get to decide about lessons." The afternoon passed in a blur of exploration. Grace pulled books from the library shelves, reading passages about Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes. Caleb was entranced by descriptions of their hardy ponies. Eli absorbed information about trade routes and military strategy like a sponge. They drew maps, acted out cavalry charges, discussed why the Mongol Empire eventually fell. "You're a good teacher," Eli said quietly when Caleb had run off to find a toy horse. "Better than Miss Davies." "Thank you. I love teaching. I've missed it." "Then why did you stop?" How to explain to a child? Grace chose honesty. "I taught in a town school, but I made some people angry by trying to teach things they didn't think were important, so they dismissed me. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But fairness and reality don't always align." Eli studied her with those 2 old eyes. "Is that why you married Papa? Because you had nowhere else to go?" "Yes," Grace said simply. "I was desperate and afraid. Your father offered safety. But you don't love him." "I don't know him well enough to love him, but I'm hoping we can all learn to be a family, even if we didn't start the traditional way." Eli absorbed this. "I heard Mrs. Brennan talking. She said, 'You're very brave.' I don't feel brave. I feel terrified most of the time. Being scared but doing it anyway is what brave means." He hesitated. "That's what Mama used to say." Grace's throat tightened. "Your Mama sounds like she was very wise." "She was." Eli looked down at his hands. "I'm trying not to forget her, but it's getting harder. Her voice is fading in my head." "Would you like to tell me about her? I'd love to hear." And so Eli talked, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. He told Grace about Sarah's laugh, about how she sang while doing chores, about her patience with his questions, and her gentleness with his fears. Grace listened, storing away these details, learning about the woman whose life she'd inherited. When Jonathan came in for dinner, he found his sons animated and talkative, showing him maps they'd drawn and facts they'd learned. His eyebrows rose. "What happened to your regular lessons?" "Mama taught us about Mongolia," Caleb announced. "They had horses that could run forever and ever." Jonathan's gaze shifted to Grace. "Mama?" "I hope you don't mind," Grace said quickly. "I wanted to assess their progress myself. Miss Davies is competent, but the boys need more engagement. Mongolia seems an unusual choice." History is interconnected. Geography, culture, military strategy, animal husbandry, all wrapped into one compelling story. The boys were interested, which is half the battle. And you're qualified to teach them? The question stung, though his tone wasn't hostile. I taught for 2 years. I know how children learn. These boys are bright. They need to be challenged, not just drilled. Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Continue then. If you think Miss Davies is insufficient, you have my permission to alter the arrangement. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. This was something Grace knew how to do, a way to be useful and necessary. That night, after the boys were asleep, Jonathan found her in the library again. She'd been reading, losing herself in words the way she always had. "You're good with them," he said abruptly. "I'm a teacher. Children are my calling." Sarah was good with them too. Natural, instinctive. He stood by the fire, silhouetted by flames. I worried no one could fill that role. I'm not filling her role. I'm creating my own. Yes. Something in his voice suggested approval. That's better, actually. The boys don't need a ghost. Grace closed her book. Tell me about her, about Sarah. Why? Because she's part of this family's story, part of your story, and if I'm to be here, I should understand. Jonathan was silent so long Grace thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, he began to speak. We met when I was 23, just establishing the ranch. She was 19, visiting relatives in town. He paused, searching for words. She was light, pure joy. She found wonder in everything. A sunrise, a wildflower, a foal being born. I was already serious, driven. She balanced me. How did you court her? A ghost of a smile crossed his face. I didn't know how. I was terrible at it. Finally just asked her straight out if she'd consider marrying a rancher who had more ambition than sense. She laughed and said yes. And you were happy? Happier than I'd known was possible. She made this house a home. Made me better than I was. His voice roughened. When Caleb was born, there were complications. The doctor said she was bleeding internally, but there was nothing he could do. She knew she was dying. Her last words to me were, "Take care of our boys. Don't let grief make you hard." I've failed that promise every day since. Grace's heart ached for him, for the boys, for Sarah, who'd loved them all so much. You haven't failed. You've survived. You've kept the boys safe and the ranch thriving. You've done your best. My best hasn't been enough. It's been enough to keep going. That counts for something. Jonathan turned to face her fully. That's why you're here. Because I finally admitted I needed help. The boys deserve better than a father haunted by ghosts. They deserve a father who loved their mother and still grieves her. That's not weakness, Jonathan. It's love. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, that she understood. You're more perceptive than I expected. I'm a teacher. Reading people is part of the job. Grace stood. I should retire. Tomorrow, I'm taking the boys outside. They need fresh air and play, not just books. It's winter. They're children, not porcelain. A little cold won't hurt them. As she passed him, Jonathan caught her wrist gently. Thank you for today. The boys haven't been that animated in months. His hand was warm on her skin, and for a moment Grace was acutely aware of how close they stood, of the breadth of his shoulders and the intensity of his gaze. Then he released her and stepped back. Good night, Mrs. Hale. Good night. In her room, Grace prepared for bed with hands that trembled slightly. That moment in the library had been something. Not romance. They'd both made clear this wasn't that kind of marriage. But perhaps the first stirring of genuine connection, of two people seeing each other as more than contractual obligations. It was more than she'd expected from this arrangement, and far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. The next days fell into a rhythm. Grace took over the boys' education entirely, combining lessons with adventures. They studied botany by identifying winter-dormant plants. They learned mathematics through measuring fence posts and calculating feed rations. They practiced reading by acting out plays in the library. Slowly, imperceptibly, the house began to change. Laughter echoed in hallways that had been silent too long. The boys brought their energy and chaos into rooms that had been preserved like museums. Grace opened curtains, rearranged furniture, slowly made the space more livable and less like a shrine. Jonathan watched these transformations with an expression Grace couldn't read. Sometimes she caught him staring at her with something that might have been curiosity or might have been concern, but he said nothing, and the distance between them remained vast. At night, Grace lay in Sarah's bed in Sarah's room, wearing Sarah's dresses, and wondered if she'd ever truly belong here or if she'd always be the replacement who didn't quite fit. 3 weeks into her new life, Grace woke to the sound of men shouting. She sat up in the pre-dawn darkness, heart hammering, listening. More voices, urgent and tense, followed by the thunder of hooves. Something was wrong. She threw on her robe and hurried to the window. In the yard below, lanterns bobbed as ranch hands ran toward the barn. She could see Jonathan, already dressed, striding toward Charlie. Even from this distance, his body language radiated fury. Grace was pulling on clothes when Mrs. Brennan knocked. "Don't come down, Mrs. Hale. There's been trouble with the cattle." "What kind of trouble?" "Rustlers hit the north pasture, killed 2 of our hands, and made off with near 50 head." The housekeeper's face was grim. "The master and the men are riding out to track them." Grace's blood ran cold. "Is it dangerous?" "Cattle thieves are always dangerous, especially ones willing to kill. But the master knows what he's doing. Mrs. Brennan tried to sound reassuring and failed. "Best you stay with the boys, keep them calm." But the boys had already heard the commotion. Eli appeared in the hallway, pale-faced, with Caleb clinging to his hand. "What's happening? Where's Papa going?" Grace knelt to their level. "There's been some trouble with the cattle. Your father is handling it. He'll be back soon." "Are the bad men coming here?" Caleb's voice was small and frightened. "No, sweetheart. The ranch hands are here, and we're perfectly safe in the house." Grace pulled both boys into an embrace, feeling Eli's tension and Caleb's trembling. "How about we make a fort in the library? We can have breakfast there and read stories until your father returns." It was a distraction that worked for Caleb, but not for Eli. The older boy kept drifting to windows, watching the horizon with eyes too worried for 7 years old. Grace understood that fear, the terror of losing another parent, of the world proving once again that it could snatch away everything you loved. "He'll come back," she told Eli quietly, while Caleb built towers with books. "Your father is strong and smart. He'll come back." "Mama thought she'd come back from having Caleb," Eli said flatly. "She didn't." Grace had no answer for that. She simply sat beside him, a steady presence, while they waited. The day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Grace tried to maintain normalcy, lessons, lunch, quiet activities, but tension hummed beneath everything. Mrs. Brennan brought updates when she could. The men had tracked the Rustlers east toward the Badlands. There had been no word since mid-morning. By evening, with still no sign of Jonathan, Grace's own worry had grown into a tight knot in her chest. She got the boys ready for bed, reading extra stories to Caleb, and sitting with Eli until his breathing deepened into sleep. Then she returned downstairs to wait. Mrs. Brennan found her in the parlor around 8. "You should rest, Mrs. Hale. Could be hours yet." "I can't sleep, not while he's out there." The housekeeper gave her a knowing look. "You care for him." "I barely know him," Grace protested. "But he's my husband, and the boy's father. Of course I'm concerned." "There's concern, and then there's this." Mrs. Brennan gestured at Grace's white-knuckled hands. "You're terrified." Grace opened her mouth to deny it, then slumped. "What if something happens to him? What if those men killed him too? The boys have already lost so much. They can't lose him." "And what about you? What about me? What would you lose if Jonathan Hale didn't come home?" Grace stared at the older woman, unable to articulate the confusing tangle of emotions. Security, yes. The boys she was growing to love. But also something else, something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The possibility of more than this cold arrangement. The hope that the man who spoke so carefully about his dead wife, who watched his sons with such fierce love, might someday look at her with something beyond contractual obligation. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd lose, and that terrifies me even more." The sound of horses interrupted them. Grace flew to the window, heart in her throat. A group of riders approached, and in the lead was Jonathan's distinctive silhouette. He was slumped slightly in the saddle, favoring his left side, but he was alive. Grace was out the door before she could think, running across the yard in her house slippers. heedless of propriety or cold. Jonathan dismounted stiffly, saying something to Charlie, and then Grace was there. "You're hurt," she said, seeing blood on his shirt. "It's nothing. Grazed by a bullet, that's all." His voice was rough with exhaustion. "We got most of the cattle back. The thieves, they won't be stealing from anyone again." There was something dark in his tone that told Grace exactly what that meant. She pushed away the questions and focused on the practical. "You need that wound cleaned and dressed. Come inside." "I can manage. Jonathan Hale, you will come inside right now and let me tend that injury, or so help me I will drag you." Grace's voice carried steel she didn't know she possessed. "Your sons have been worried sick all day. The least you can do is not die of infection out of sheer stubbornness." Charlie coughed to cover a laugh. Jonathan stared at Grace as if seeing her for the first time, then nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." In the kitchen, Grace boiled water while Mrs. Brennan fetched bandages and whiskey. Jonathan sat heavily at the table, peeling off his coat and shirt to reveal a nasty furrow across his ribs. Not deep, but bloody and certain to hurt. "Who did this?" Grace asked, cleaning the wound as gently as she could. "One of the Rustlers. We cornered them in a canyon. They chose to fight rather than surrender." Jonathan's jaw tightened as she pressed cloth to the injury. "We had no choice." "I know." Grace didn't judge. This was harsh country that demanded harsh choices. "Did we lose anyone else?" "No. The boys who died in the initial raid, they were good men, young. I've sent word to their families." His voice roughened. "They died protecting what's mine. That's on me." "That's on the men who killed them," Grace corrected firmly. "You didn't pull the trigger. I brought them here, gave them jobs, made them targets." Grace paused in her ministrations to meet his eyes. "By that logic, you're responsible for every good thing that ever happened to them too. The wages that fed their families, the skills they learned, the purpose they found. You don't get to claim only the bad, Jonathan." Something flickered in his gaze, surprise, gratitude, something softer than she'd seen before. "You have a way of cutting through nonsense. Teacher skill." Grace returned to bandaging, wrapping clean cloth around his ribs. "You'll need to rest tomorrow. No riding out. Let Charlie and the men handle things." "I can't just..." "You can and you will. Your sons need you alive more than they need you working yourself to death." Grace tied off the bandage, perhaps a bit tighter than necessary. "Besides, you hired me to manage the household. Well, I'm managing, and I say you rest." Jonathan caught her wrist, not roughly but firmly. "When did you become so commanding?" "When I married a stubborn rancher who thinks he's invincible." Grace tried to pull away, but he held fast, his thumb tracing circles on her pulse point. The touch was absent, almost unconscious, but it sent heat flooding through her. "Grace." Her name and his voice sounded different somehow. "Thank you for waiting up, for caring whether I came home." "Of course I cared. The boys, not just the boys." His eyes held hers. "You were worried about me." Grace couldn't deny it. "Yes, I was worried. You may be impossible and cold and emotionally distant, but you're also my husband, and I find I'm rather invested in your continued survival." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Impossible and cold?" Did I stutter? "No, ma'am." The smile widened fractionally. "Emotionally distant seems fair, too." "I'm glad we agree." Grace finally pulled her wrist free, acutely aware that Mrs. Brennan was watching this exchange with undisguised interest. "Now go to bed before you fall over. Doctor will be here tomorrow to check that wound properly." Jonathan stood, moving carefully. At the doorway, he paused. "Grace? The boys are lucky to have you. I'm beginning to think I might be too." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her standing in the kitchen with her heart doing complicated things in her chest. "Well now," Mrs. Brennan said softly. "That was interesting." "It was nothing." "That was definitely something, Mrs. Hale. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Grace had no answer. She retreated to her room, but sleep was impossible. She kept replaying the evening, her terror when Jonathan hadn't returned, her relief at seeing him alive, The way his thumb had traced circles on her wrist, the softness in his voice when he'd spoken her name. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was a practical arrangement, a business transaction. She wasn't supposed to care whether he lived or died beyond the practical implications. She certainly wasn't supposed to feel her pulse jump when he touched her. But she did. Heaven help her, she did. The next morning brought the doctor, who pronounced Jonathan's wound clean but ordered rest. Jonathan argued. Grace overruled him with a look that made even Charlie grin. The rancher stayed in bed, grumbling about wasted time and work piling up, while Grace managed the household and kept the boys occupied. "Is Papa really okay?" Eli asked for the 10th time. "He's fine. Grumpy because he hates resting, but fine." Grace looked up from the arithmetic problem she'd set for him. "Why don't we take him lunch? I bet he's bored." They found Jonathan propped up in bed, surrounded by paperwork he'd insisted on having brought to him. Caleb launched himself at his father with a squeal, while Eli hung back, torn between relief and residual fear. "I see you're following doctor's orders," Grace said dryly, noting the ledgers. "I'm resting. I'm just resting productively." Jonathan ruffled Caleb's hair. "How are my boys?" "We did sums," Caleb announced, "and Mama said we could visit the barn later to see the new foal." "Did she now?" Jonathan's eyes found Grace's. "Mama seems to be running things efficiently." "Someone has to, since you're temporarily indisposed." Grace set down the lunch tray. "Eat, all of it. Mrs. Brennan made your favorites." "Are you always this bossy?" "Only when dealing with stubborn patients." Grace shooed the boys toward the door. "Give your father time to eat, then you can visit longer." But before she could follow them out, Jonathan spoke again. "Grace? Stay. Please." She turned, surprised by the please. Jonathan wasn't a man who said that word often. "The boys can manage for 10 minutes. I want to talk to you." Grace closed the door and approached the bed cautiously. "If this is about the household accounts, I've been reviewing them, and it's not about accounts." Jonathan gestured to the chair beside the bed. "Sit, please." She sat, folding her hands in her lap, trying to ignore how domestic this felt. A wife visiting her recovering husband, discussing their day. Except they weren't really that, were they? "I owe you an apology," Jonathan said abruptly. "For what?" "For treating you like a piece of furniture, a useful object to fill a role." He met her eyes squarely. "You're more than that. These past weeks, watching you with the boys, seeing how you've brought life back to this house. I've been blind." Grace's throat tightened. "I was just doing what we agreed." "No, you've done far more than we agreed. You've given my sons something I couldn't, joy, purpose. You've turned lessons into adventures and this house into a home again. And yesterday when I rode out, you waited. You cared. That's not in any contract." "I'm not made of stone, Jonathan. Of course I cared." "I am made of stone. Or I thought I was." His hand moved toward hers, hovering, before settling gently over her fingers. "Sarah's death broke something in me. I thought it couldn't be fixed. Didn't want it to be fixed, because fixing it felt like forgetting her. You'll never forget her. The boys won't let you, even if you wanted to. She's part of your story, part of theirs. But she's not part of yours." Jonathan's thumb traced her knuckles. "And I'm beginning to realize that might be all right. That letting someone new in doesn't erase what came before." Grace's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this arrangement we made. It doesn't have to stay cold and distant. If you're willing, if you want, we could try to make it real." "Real?" The word came out as a whisper. "A real marriage, a real family. Not just for the boys' sake, but for ours." His grip tightened slightly. "I won't rush you. I won't demand anything. But I want you to know the possibility is there, if you want it." Grace stared at their joined hands, her mind reeling. A month ago she'd been starving and freezing, accepting a loveless marriage for survival. Now this man, this complicated, grief-stricken, impossible man, was offering her something more. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what I feel." "Take all the time you need." Jonathan released her hand, but his expression was warmer than she'd ever seen it. "I'll be here. We have a year, remember? Plenty of time to figure things out." Grace stood on shaking legs. Rest. Eat your lunch. I'll bring the boys back later. She fled the room, heart racing, and nearly collided with Mrs. Brennan in the hallway. The housekeeper took one look at her face and smiled knowingly. Told you it was something. I don't know what it is, Grace admitted, but it's definitely something. The next week passed in a strange limbo. Jonathan recovered quickly, returning to work despite the doctor's recommendations. But something had shifted between them. He sought her out more often, asking her opinion on ranch matters. He joined family meals instead of working through them. He read with the boys at bedtime, with Grace sitting nearby, and sometimes their eyes would meet over the children's heads with an understanding that hadn't been there before. The boys noticed. Caleb, with childish delight, announcing frequently that his family was just like other families now. Eli with more caution, watching the adults with that too perceptive gaze, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Do you love Papa? He asked Grace one afternoon, cornering her in the library. That's a complicated question, Eli. It's a yes or no question. Grace set down her book. Love isn't always simple. Your father and I married for practical reasons, but we're learning to be partners, to respect each other, to care. Whether that becomes love, I don't know yet. But you want it to? Did she? Grace examined her heart honestly. Yes, I think I do. Your father is a good man, difficult, stubborn, but good. And you boys are wonderful. This could be a real family if we let it. Mama said love is a choice, Eli said quietly. Not just a feeling. You choose to love someone every day. Your mama was very wise. So you could choose to love Papa, and he could choose to love you. We could. Grace pulled Eli onto her lap, though he was getting big for it. Would that be okay with you if your father and I truly became a couple? Eli was quiet for a long moment. I don't want to forget Mama. You won't, ever. She'll always be your mother, your first mother. I'm just an addition, not a replacement. Promise? I promise. Eli leaned against her, and Grace held him, this boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who carried grief and responsibility like twin weights. Slowly, carefully, they were all learning to be a family. Then came the night that changed everything. It was early March, with winter reluctantly loosening its grip. Grace woke to Caleb screaming. She was running before she was fully conscious, bursting into the boys' room to find Caleb sitting up in bed, sobbing hysterically. Caleb, sweetheart, what's wrong? She gathered him into her arms, checking for injuries, for fever, for any sign of illness. Bad men coming, Caleb wailed. You had a nightmare, baby. You're safe. There are no bad men. Yes, there are. I heard them. Grace stroked his hair, making soothing sounds, but her own heart raced. Caleb's fear felt too specific, too real for a simple nightmare. And then she heard it, the sound that must have woken him. Horses, multiple horses, moving fast, coming toward the house, in the middle of the night, when no one should be riding. Grace's blood turned to ice. She looked across the room and found Eli sitting up in bed, white-faced. Get your brother and hide in the wardrobe, she ordered quietly. Don't come out until your father or I get you. Understand? Grace, now, Eli. The older boy scrambled out of bed and grabbed Caleb, pulling him toward the wardrobe. Grace ran to the hallway just as Jonathan emerged from his room, pulling on pants, a pistol already in his hand. You heard? He asked tersely. Yes. The boys are hiding. Good. Get to our room and lock the door. Don't come out. Like hell. Grace's voice was steel. This is my home, too. Those are my sons. I'm not hiding. Jonathan looked like he wanted to argue, but there was no time. Downstairs, glass shattered. Men's voices, rough and cruel, echoed up from below. Mrs. Brennan screamed. The hands are in the bunkhouse, Jonathan said grimly. Too far to help quickly. Stay behind me. They moved down the stairs together, Jonathan's gun raised. In the parlor, 5 men ransacked the room. One held Mrs. Brennan by the arm, a knife to her throat. Another was stuffing silver into a sack. The remaining 3 turned as Jonathan appeared, their own weapons drawn. Well now, drawled the one holding Mrs. Brennan, if it ain't Mr. High and Mighty Hale himself, We've been wanting a word with you. Grace recognized him from Jonathan's description. Jake Mason, brother to one of the Rustlers killed in the canyon. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same cruel twist to the mouth. "Let her go, Mason," Jonathan said evenly. "Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, we'll get to you, but first we're going to make you watch while we take everything you got. Your silver, your money, your woman." Mason's eyes slid to Grace, and his smile widened. "Pretty little thing. New wife, I hear. Be a shame if something happened to her." "Touch her and you'll die screaming," Jonathan said flatly. "Big talk from a man outnumbered 5-1. Mason gestured to his companions. "Boys, grab the woman. Let's show Hale what happens when he kills our kin." Two men moved toward Grace. She backed up the stairs, heart hammering, searching for anything to use as a weapon. Her hand closed on a decorative vase on the banister. As the first man reached for her, she swung it with all her strength. It connected with his temple with a sickening crunch. The man dropped like a stone. The second hesitated, and Grace ran, not away, but toward the boys' room. If these men were here for revenge, they wouldn't stop with Jonathan and her. They'd hurt the children too. She burst into the boys' room and dragged a heavy bureau across the door, then turned to the wardrobe. "Eli, listen to me. There's a trellis outside your window. Can you climb down with Caleb?" "I think so." Eli's voice shook but held steady. "Then go. Get to the bunkhouse. Get help. Run and don't look back, no matter what you hear." "But you—" "I'll be fine. Protect your brother. Go." She helped them out the window, watching until they'd started down the trellis, then turned back to the barricaded door. Men pounded on it, cursing. The bureau wouldn't hold long. Grace looked around desperately for weapons. Her eyes landed on the fireplace poker. She grabbed it, testing the weight. Not much, but it was something. The door splintered. A man forced his way through, and Grace swung the poker. She caught him in the shoulder, making him howl, but he was bigger and stronger. He wrenched the poker away and backhanded her, sending her sprawling. "Little wildcat, ain't you?" he snarled. "Boss wants you alive," but he didn't say unmarked. Grace scrambled backward, tasting blood. The man advanced, and she knew she couldn't fight him off, but she could delay him. Every second gave Eli and Caleb more distance, gave Jonathan more time. "You want me?" she said, forcing her voice steady. "Come and get me." Downstairs a gunshot rang out. Then another. Men shouted. Grace prayed Jonathan was still alive, still fighting. The man in front of her lunged, and Grace threw herself sideways, grabbing for anything. Her hand found a heavy book, and she hurled it at his face. It bought her seconds. She made it to the door, but he caught her hair, yanking her backward. Grace screamed, more in fury than fear, and drove her elbow into his gut. He grunted but didn't let go. Then the door exploded inward, and Jonathan was there, his face a mask of cold rage. The gun in his hand fired once. The man holding Grace crumpled. "Are you hurt?" Jonathan demanded, pulling her away from the body. "The boys. I sent them out the window, to get help." "Smart." He reloaded quickly. "There's 3 more downstairs, plus Mason. Can you shoot? I've never— Here." He pressed a smaller pistol into her hands. "Point and pull the trigger. Don't hesitate. These men won't show you mercy." They moved back downstairs together. Grace's hand shook as she held the unfamiliar weapon, but determination steadied them. In the parlor, Mrs. Brennan was free, huddled by the fireplace. 2 men lay motionless on the floor. Jonathan must have killed them. That left 2 more, plus Mason. They'd fortified themselves behind overturned furniture, using it as cover. "This ain't over, Hale!" Mason shouted. "You killed my brother! You're gonna pay!" "Your brother chose his path. So did you." Jonathan's voice was ice. "Leave now, and I'll let you live." "Not a chance!" The exchange of gunfire was deafening. Grace crouched beside Mrs. Brennan, gun raised, searching for targets. One of Mason's men popped up to shoot, and Grace didn't think. She aimed and fired. The recoil nearly knocked her over, and the shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the man duck. Jonathan used the distraction to move closer, and his next shot didn't miss. The man fell. Mason and his last companion ran for the back door. Jonathan started to follow, but Grace caught his arm. "Let them go. The boys are safe. We're alive. Let it be enough." For a moment, Jonathan looked like he'd argue. Then he nodded sharply. "Charlie will track them down." They won't get far. The sound of running feet came from outside. The ranch hands, finally alerted. Charlie burst through the door, gun drawn, and took in the scene with wide eyes. "Boss, we heard shots." "It's handled," Jonathan cut him off. "But Mason and one other escaped through the back. Take the men and find them. I want them alive, if possible. Dead, if not." Charlie nodded and was gone. Jonathan turned to Grace, his hand suddenly on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her face. "You're bleeding." "Just a split lip. Jonathan, I'm fine." "Fine," his voice cracked. "You were attacked. In our home. Where you should have been safe." "But I'm alive. We're all alive." Grace reached up to cup his face. "Thanks to you. And the boys are safe. That's what matters." Jonathan pulled her against him so suddenly she gasped. His arms locked around her, holding tight enough to bruise, and Grace felt him shaking. "When I saw that man grab you, when I thought, I know." She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly. "I know." They stood like that, two people who'd started as strangers, clinging to each other in the aftermath of violence. Around them, ranch hands moved through the house, carrying out bodies, assessing damage. Mrs. Brennan directed cleanup with shaking hands, but Grace and Jonathan remained locked together, finding comfort in shared survival. "You were so brave," Jonathan murmured into her hair. "Sending the boys to safety, fighting back, standing with me. You could have hidden, should have hidden. This is my family now, my home. I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me." Jonathan pulled back enough to look at her, and Grace saw something new in his eyes. Not just respect or gratitude, but something warmer, something that made her breath catch. "Grace Hale," he said softly, "you are the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." Before she could respond, the front door burst open and two small bodies hurtled inside. "Mama! Papa!" Caleb threw himself at them, sobbing. Eli was right behind, his face streaked with tears. Grace and Jonathan knelt together, gathering the boys close, forming a tight circle of 4. They held each other while Caleb cried and Eli tried valiantly not to, while ranch hands worked around them and dawn began to break outside. "Everyone's safe," Jonathan said firmly. "The bad men are gone. We're all safe." "I was so scared," Eli whispered. "I thought they'd hurt you." "They tried," Grace said, smoothing his hair. "But we protected each other. That's what families do." The word hung in the air. Family. Not a contract, not an arrangement. A real family, forged in shared danger and cemented by mutual protection. Jonathan's eyes found Grace's over the boys' heads, and in his gaze she saw a question and an answer all at once. This was real now. They were real. Whatever had started as a transaction had become something else entirely, something worth fighting for, worth living for, worth loving for. The sun rose over a house transformed by violence, and in its light, Grace saw the full extent of the damage. Shattered glass littered the parlor floor. Furniture lay overturned, cushions slashed, drawers ransacked. Blood stained the carpet where men had fallen. The home she'd been carefully nurturing back to life looked like a battlefield. But they were alive. All of them, whole and breathing, and that made everything else manageable. The boys refused to leave their parents' sides. Caleb clung to Grace like a burr, while Eli shadowed Jonathan with silent intensity. They ate breakfast together in the kitchen, the formal dining room being unusable, and Grace noted how Jonathan kept one hand on Eli's shoulder the entire time, as if reassuring himself his son was real and safe. "Charlie caught up with Mason and his man about 5 miles out," Jonathan said quietly, speaking over the boys' heads to Grace. "They won't be troubling anyone again." Grace understood what he wasn't saying. The men were dead. Justice dispensed quickly and finally on the Montana frontier. She should have felt something about that. Horror, perhaps, or moral conflict. Instead, she felt only relief. Those men had threatened her family. Now they couldn't anymore. "Good," she said simply, and saw approval flash in Jonathan's eyes. By mid-morning, the house buzzed with activity. Ranch hands repaired windows and doors. Mrs. Brennan directed an army of cleaning women from town. The doctor arrived to check everyone over, pronouncing Grace's split lip minor and praising Eli's bravery in getting his brother to safety. That boy's got the makings of a fine man, Doc Henderson told Jonathan. Kept his head when grown men would have panicked. He gets that from his mother, Jonathan said, and it took Grace a moment to realize he meant her, not Sarah. The recognition sent warmth flooding through her chest. By afternoon, when the immediate chaos had settled, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Grace found herself shaking as she supervised the hanging of new curtains, her hands unsteady enough that Mrs. Brennan gently took the fabric from her. Delayed shock, the housekeeper said kindly. Perfectly natural. You've been running on determination and terror. Now that it's over, your body's catching up. Go rest, Mrs. Hale. We can manage here. But Grace couldn't rest. If she stopped moving, she'd have to think about how close they'd come to disaster. How easily Jonathan could have been killed, leaving her alone with two grieving boys. How that man's hands had felt in her hair, how his voice had promised violation and pain. She found herself in the library, the one room relatively untouched by the violence. Her hands trembled as she pulled a book from the shelf, trying to lose herself in words the way she always had. But for once, reading offered no escape. The sentences swam before her eyes. Grace? She turned to find Jonathan in the doorway, his expression concerned. You should be resting, the doctor said. I can't rest. Every time I close my eyes, I see it again. That man grabbing me, the gun in your hand, the blood. Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. I keep thinking about what could have happened. To you, to the boys, to all of us. Jonathan crossed the room and gently took the book from her hands, setting it aside. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled her into his arms, not with the desperate clutch of the early morning, but with steady, grounding strength. But it didn't happen, he said quietly. We survived. You survived because you were brave and fierce and protected what matters most. Don't let fear steal that victory from you. Grace buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of soap and leather and something uniquely him. I was terrified. So was I. When I saw that man put his hands on you, I felt something I haven't felt since Sarah died. Absolute terror of losing someone He paused, then continued carefully. Someone who matters to me. Grace pulled back to look at him. I matter to you? You know you do. These past weeks, watching you transform this house, seeing you with my sons, learning who you are beneath the desperation that brought you here. Grace, you matter. More than I expected, more than I thought possible. Jonathan, Let me finish, please. His hands framed her face, thumbs gentle on her cheekbones. I told you we could make this real, this marriage of ours. I said I wanted to try. But last night changed things. Last night made me realize I'm not just willing to try. I'm already halfway there. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Halfway where? To loving you. The words came out rough, as if admitting them cost him something. I didn't think I could love again. Didn't want to. Sarah's loss nearly destroyed me, and I swore I'd never give my heart to another woman. But you, Grace, you've been stealing pieces of it since the moment you agreed to stay. Since you stood up to me about the boys' education. Since you waited up when I rode out after Rustlers. Since you fought beside me last night instead of hiding like any sensible person would have done. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. You can't mean that. We barely know each other. This was supposed to be practical, remember? Just an arrangement. Arrangements don't make your hand shake when you think someone might die. Arrangements don't make you fight like a wildcat to protect children who aren't yours by blood. Arrangements don't feel like this. He pressed her palm over his heart and she felt it racing. Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me I'm alone in this and I'll back away. I'll give you all the time and space you need. Grace couldn't tell him that, because she did feel it. This terrifying, exhilarating pull toward a man she'd married for shelter and survival. Somewhere between teaching his sons and running his household and fighting beside him in the darkness, she'd started falling. I'm scared, she whispered, of this, of what it means, of losing it once I have it. So am I. Jonathan's forehead touched hers. Loving someone means giving them the power to destroy you. I know that better than most. But Grace, not loving you, not even trying, that scares me more. What about Sarah? You said you loved her, that you always would. I will always love her. She was my first love, the mother of my sons, and part of my history. But she's gone, and I'm still here, still living. And I'm beginning to understand that I can honor her memory while still choosing to move forward. His voice dropped. I think she'd want that. Want me to be happy again. Want the boys to have a mother who truly loves them and their father. I do love them, Grace said. Your boys. They've stolen my heart completely. Just my boys? Grace met his eyes, those startling blue eyes that had seemed so cold when she first arrived and now burned with intensity. No, not just them. Grace. Her name was a prayer and a question. May I kiss you? Not like at the wedding, a real kiss, because I want to, not because a judge says I should. In answer, Grace rose on her toes and closed the distance between them. Their lips met softly at first, tentative, learning the shape and taste of each other. Then Jonathan's arms tightened around her and the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and desperate and full of all the fear and relief and hope they'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace felt dizzy. Well, she managed, that was overdue, Jonathan finished. We should have done that weeks ago. We had an arrangement, remember? No romance. Arrangements change, people change, like... He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I've changed, Grace. Because of you. The man who proposed this marriage was frozen, shut down, barely alive. You've thawed something in me I thought was permanently dead. You've changed me too, Grace admitted. I came here desperate and afraid, accepting scraps because I had no other choice. But you've given me so much more than shelter. You've given me purpose, family, a place to belong. You've made me brave. You were always brave. You just needed the right battle to fight. Jonathan kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. And speaking of battles, we need to talk about what happens next. Next? Word of the attack will spread. People in town will have opinions about it, about us, about our marriage. Some will say you're bad luck, that trouble followed you here. Others will question whether a woman who taught school for 2 years has any business running a ranch household. We need to present a united front. Grace stiffened slightly. So this is about appearances? No. This is about protecting what's ours, our family, our home, our life together. Jonathan's expression was fierce. Let them talk. Let them question. I know what I have, what we're building, and I won't let small-minded gossips tear it down. What are we building exactly? A real marriage, a real family, a life that's ours, not defined by the past or by other people's expectations. He took both her hands. Grace, I want to do this properly. Woo you the way you deserved from the start. Court you, even though we're already married. Take time to know each other beyond crisis and necessity. I'd like that, Grace said softly. Though we might be doing things slightly backwards. We've been doing everything backwards from the start. Why stop now? Jonathan's smile was the warmest she'd ever seen from him. Besides, the boys will be thrilled. Caleb's been asking when Papa and Mama will start acting like other parents do, whatever that means to a 3-year-old. And Eli? Eli's been watching us like a hawk, waiting to see if this is real or if we're just playing house. Last night proved something to him, I think, that we'll fight for each other and for them, that we're truly a family now. As if summoned by his name, Eli appeared in the doorway. Papa? Mama? People are coming, lots of people. Jonathan and Grace exchanged glances and moved to the window. Sure enough, a line of wagons and riders approached from town. Grace recognized several families, including Edgar Morrison from the school board and Silas Garrett, the man whose complaint had cost her her position. What do they want? Grace asked, tension creeping back into her shoulders. To gawk, probably. Maybe to help. Hard to tell with this bunch. Jonathan squeezed her hand. Remember, united front. We face them together. They went out to the porch, and Grace was acutely aware of her split lip, her rumpled clothes, the evidence of violence still visible in the house behind them. Jonathan stood beside her, his hand at the small of her back, a claiming gesture that wouldn't be lost on anyone watching. Morrison climbed down from his wagon first, looking uncomfortable. Mr. Hale, Mrs. Hale, We heard about the attack, wanted to make sure everyone was all right. We're fine, Morrison, shaken but whole. We brought supplies, Mrs. Patterson called out, gesturing to her loaded wagon. Food, linens, whatever you might need, and some of the menfolk can help with repairs. Grace was stunned. These were the same people who'd turned their backs on her, who'd let her be dismissed and cast out. Now they were offering help? We heard how you fought them off, said Mr. Chen from the general store. How you protected your family, Mrs. Hale. That took real courage. We also heard, Silas Garrett spoke up, his voice grudging, that you could have run, could have hidden, but you stood and fought. That's admirable. For a woman, or anyone else. Grace found her voice. Thank you. We appreciate the help. The house took significant damage, and extra hands would be welcome. There's something else, Morrison said, shuffling his feet. Mrs. Hale, the school board has reconsidered your dismissal. We acted hastily, and we'd like to offer you your position back, if you're interested. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and entirely too late. Grace felt Jonathan's hand press more firmly against her back, a silent reminder that she had choices now. She didn't need their permission or their charity. That's very generous, Mr. Morrison, but I must decline. I have a family to care for now, and my own sons to educate. Perhaps you could recommend someone else, someone who won't be dismissed for actually teaching children to think. Several people had the grace to look ashamed. Morrison nodded stiffly. Of course. We understand. The offer remains open, should you change your mind. I won't, but I appreciate the gesture. Grace straightened her shoulders. Now, if you'd truly like to help, the parlor needs new windows, and Mrs. Brennan can direct you to other tasks. We'd be grateful for the assistance. The crowd dispersed, people moving to help with various repairs. Grace watched them go, feeling something shift inside her. These people had rejected her when she was desperate. Now they sought to help, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of genuine concern. Either way, she no longer needed them the way she once had. You handled that well, Jonathan murmured. I had a good teacher in stubbornness and pride, Grace replied, earning a soft laugh. Papa, Mama! Caleb came running out, nearly tripping over his own feet. Mrs. Henderson brought cookies. Can we have some? After lunch, Jonathan said firmly. Which reminds me, Mrs. Hale, perhaps you should supervise the kitchen. I have a feeling we're about to be feeding half the town. Grace nodded and followed Caleb inside, leaving Jonathan to coordinate the men working on repairs. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Brennan already organizing donated food with military precision. Well now, the housekeeper said, eyeing Grace's rumpled appearance and bruised lip. You look like you've been through an ordeal, and yet you're glowing. Interesting combination. I am not glowing. You absolutely are. The master finally said something, didn't he? Grace felt her cheeks heat. That's private. Everything's private until it's not, and in a household this size, nothing stays secret long. Mrs. Brennan's expression softened. I'm glad, Mrs. Hale. Truly. The master's been half dead these past 3 years. You've brought him back to life. That's worth more than all the silver those thieves tried to steal. The day passed in a blur of activity. By evening, the house looked almost normal again. New glass gleamed in repaired windows. The parlor had been cleaned and reorganized. Small damages had been mended. The town folk departed with promises to check in again soon, leaving Grace and Jonathan standing on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. They meant well, Grace said. They meant to assuage their guilt. But yes, the help was genuine enough. Jonathan turned to face her. You turned down the teaching position. I did. No regrets? Grace considered this. Teaching had been her calling, her purpose, but that was before she'd found something even more important. None. The boys need me here. You need me here. And honestly, Jonathan, I need to be here. This is my home now, my family. I'm not giving that up to teach other people's children when I have my own to raise. They're lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. You saved my life, gave me everything when I had nothing. We saved each other, Jonathan corrected. You saved me from a half-life, from being a ghost in my own home. That's worth more than shelter and security. They stood close together, hands loosely clasped, watching their land darken under the approaching night. Grace felt a peace she'd never known, a sense of rightness that went soul deep. "What are you thinking?" Jonathan asked. "That a month ago I was terrified and alone, accepting a marriage to a stranger because it was my only option. And now—" Grace turned to face him. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else. Isn't that strange?" "Not strange. Fortunate. For both of us." Jonathan drew her closer. "Grace, I meant what I said earlier about courting you properly. I want to do this right. We're already married, living together, raising children. I think we've skipped most of the traditional steps. Then we'll create our own steps, our own traditions." His eyes held hers. "Marry me again? Not because you're desperate or unpractical, but because we choose each other. Because we want to." Grace felt tears prickling. "Are you proposing? Again?" "I'm proposing properly this time. Grace Ann Hale, will you be my wife? Not on paper, we already managed that part, but in heart and truth? Will you build this life with me? Not because you have to, but because you want to?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Yes, I want to. I choose you, Jonathan Hale. I choose this family, this life, this love we're building." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Grace felt something click into place. This was what she'd been searching for all along without knowing it, not just shelter or security, but belonging, connection, love freely given and received. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Jonathan said, "We should tell the boys." "Tell us what?" Eli stood in the doorway with Caleb, both looking curious. Grace and Jonathan exchanged glances, and then Jonathan beckoned them forward. "Come here, both of you." The boys approached, and Jonathan knelt so he was at their level, pulling Grace down beside him. "You know that Mama and I got married very quickly, right? That it was mostly to help each other out?" Eli nodded slowly. Caleb just looked confused. "Well, we've decided something," Jonathan continued. "We're going to have another wedding, a real one this time, with family and friends and celebration. Because we're not just helping each other out anymore. We're actually a family, a real family." "Does that mean you love Mama?" Eli asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Jonathan said simply. "I love your Mama, and she loves me, and we both love you two more than anything in the world." "So you won't send her away?" Eli's voice cracked. "Even when the year is up?" Grace felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. This was what Eli had been carrying, the fear that she was temporary, that the family they were building had an expiration date. She reached out and pulled him into her arms. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. Not in a year, not ever. This is my home. You and Caleb and your father, you're my family now. Nothing will change that." "Promise?" "I promise. With everything I am, I promise." Eli buried his face against her shoulder, and Grace felt wetness seeping through her dress. Behind them, Caleb let out a whoop of joy and threw his arms around Jonathan's neck. "We're really a family, a real family, just like I wanted." "Yes, buddy, a real family." Jonathan met Grace's eyes over the boys' heads, and the love she saw there made her breath catch. They stayed like that for a long time, the four of them huddled together on the porch as stars began to emerge overhead. This family that had been cobbled together from desperation and necessity, that had survived violence and grief, that had chosen each other when they could have walked away. Later that night, after the boys were tucked into bed and the house had settled into quiet, Grace found Jonathan in his study. He was staring at Sarah's portrait, the one that hung above his desk. "Having second thoughts?" Grace asked softly. "No, just saying goodbye, in a way." Jonathan turned to look at her. "I'll always love her. She'll always be part of my history. But I'm learning that you can love someone new without betraying someone you've lost. That the heart has infinite capacity if you let it." She sounds like she was wonderful. She was, and I think she'd be glad I found you, glad the boys have you. Jonathan held out his hand and Grace took it. "Come here. There's something I want to show you." He led her through the house to the locked master bedroom, the room he'd kept sealed since Sarah's death. Now he produced a key and opened the door. The room was exactly as it must have been 3 years ago. Clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Books sat on the nightstand. A woman's presence lingered in every detail, preserved like a museum exhibit. I couldn't face changing it, Jonathan said quietly. Couldn't bear to erase her that way. But keeping it like this, it's not healthy, for me or the boys. It's time to let go. What do you want to do with it? Pack away her personal things. The boys should have them when they're older, but the room itself... He looked at Grace. I thought we could use it, make it ours, not erasing Sarah, but acknowledging that life continues. Are you sure, Jonathan? That's a big step. I'm sure. I can't move forward while living in a shrine to the past, and I want to move forward with you. They worked together through the evening, carefully packing Sarah's dresses, her jewelry, her personal items. Jonathan handled each piece with reverence, sharing stories. This was what she wore to their first dance. These were earrings he'd given her for their anniversary. This shawl had been her favorite for cold evenings. Grace listened and helped, understanding that this was a kind of ceremony, a way of honoring the past while making space for the future. When they finished, boxes sat neatly stacked, ready for storage, and the room looked different, still beautiful, but no longer frozen in time. Thank you, Jonathan said, taking both her hands, for understanding, for not being threatened by her memory. How could I be? She made you who you are. She gave you those amazing boys. She's part of why I fell in love with you, because you're a man capable of such deep love and loyalty. Grace, Jonathan pulled her close. I want you to know something. What I feel for you, it's different from what I felt for Sarah. Not less, just different. With her, everything was easy, natural, like breathing. With you, it's chosen, deliberate, built through shared struggle and trust. That makes it no less real. Maybe even more so. I understand, and Jonathan, that's exactly what I need to hear. He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Grace felt the last barriers between them crumbling. They were truly married now, not in name only, but in every way that mattered. Partners, lovers, parents, a family, forged from desperation but sustained by choice. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Jonathan rested his forehead against hers. We're really doing this, building a life together. We really are. Are you scared? Terrified, but also more hopeful than I've been in years. He smiled, and Grace realized it was the first truly unguarded smile she'd seen from him. You're worth the risk, Grace Hale. You've always been worth it. They stood in that transformed room, holding each other as the moon rose outside the window, and Grace knew that every terrible thing that had brought her here, the loss of her position, the desperate cold of that winter day, the violence of the attack, had been worth it. Worth it to find this man, these boys, this life she'd never imagined wanting. Tomorrow, they would tell Mrs. Brennan about their plans. They would begin preparing for a real wedding, a celebration of the family they'd become. They would continue building the life they'd started, day by day, choice by choice. But tonight, they simply held each other and marveled at the strange, wonderful journey that had brought them from strangers to partners to something infinitely more precious. Love, Grace realized, didn't always arrive in expected packages. Sometimes it came dressed as necessity, as survival, as the last desperate option when all others had failed. But that didn't make it any less real or any less worth fighting for. She'd come to this ranch looking for shelter and found a home. She'd accepted a loveless marriage and discovered a love deeper than she'd imagined. She'd agreed to mother children out of obligation and found herself loving them with fierce, protective devotion. And the man who'd proposed a cold transaction had become the keeper of her heart. What are you smiling about? Jonathan asked. Just thinking about fate, destiny. Whatever brought me to your gates that day. Desperation brought you, but something else made you stay. Hope, Grace said softly. Even when I didn't recognize it, I was hoping for this. For you. For us. Then I'm grateful for hope, and for desperate, brave women who refuse to give up. Jonathan kissed her softly. Come on, let's go to bed. Tomorrow starts a new chapter, and I want to face it with you beside me. Hand in hand, they left the transformed room and walked toward their future. Uncertain, imperfect, but undeniably theirs. The morning after their declaration brought a shift in the household that everyone could feel. Grace woke in her own room still, but with the knowledge that soon that would change, that the walls between her and Jonathan were coming down in every sense. She dressed quickly and found him already in the kitchen with the boys, attempting to make breakfast while Mrs. Brennan watched with barely concealed amusement. "Papa's making pancakes," Caleb announced, though the lumpy batter in the bowl suggested otherwise. "But they look funny." "They'll taste fine," Jonathan insisted, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Grace bit back a smile and rolled up her sleeves. "Here, let me help. We'll make them together." They worked side by side, their shoulders brushing, hands occasionally touching as they passed ingredients. It was domestic and ordinary and utterly perfect. Eli watched them with cautious hope, while Caleb chattered about everything and nothing, his joy infectious. "Mrs. Hale," Mrs. Brennan said, after breakfast was cleared and the boys had run off to play, "I couldn't help but notice something different this morning, between you and the master." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching you two dance around each other for weeks. About time, if you ask me." The housekeeper's smile was genuine. "Sarah would have approved, you know. She always said the master needed someone strong enough to stand up to him. You've proven yourself that and more." "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan. That means more than you know." "Now then, if you're planning what I think you're planning, a proper wedding this time, we've got work to do. Can't have the mistress of Hale Ranch married in a study with 2 witnesses. This time we do it right." And so the planning began. Grace had never imagined having a real wedding, had certainly never dreamed of one after accepting Jonathan's cold proposal. But now, with his love freely given and their family solidified, she found herself wanting it, wanting the celebration, the public acknowledgement, the joy of choosing each other in front of everyone who mattered. "We'll need at least 6 weeks to prepare properly," Mrs. Brennan declared, pulling out paper and pencil. "Invitations, address, food, flowers, even if we have to force the greenhouse to cooperate." "Mrs. Brennan," Grace interrupted gently, "I don't need anything elaborate, just something meaningful. Family and friends, good food, and the man I love. Everything else is extra." Spoken like a true romantic. "But Mrs. Hale, you deserve the extras. You've earned them. Let me give you a proper wedding." Grace looked at the housekeeper's earnest face and felt her resistance crumble. "All right, but nothing too fancy. This is a ranch, not a palace." "Trust me, by the time we're done, this ranch will look like the finest palace in Montana." Jonathan found Grace later that afternoon in the library, surrounded by fabric swatches and invitation samples. He raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Brennan got to you, didn't she?" "She's very persuasive. Apparently we're having a proper wedding, whether I planned on it or not." "Good." Jonathan settled beside her, picking up one of the invitation samples. "You deserve a day that's about celebration, not desperation. A wedding that begins our real marriage, not just formalizes a contract." "I never thought I'd have this," Grace admitted quietly. "Any of this. A home, children who love me, a husband who looks at me like I matter. It feels like a dream. It's real. I promise you, Grace, this is all real." He took her hand, the gesture still new enough to make her pulse quicken. "And speaking of real, I have something for you." He pulled a small box from his pocket and Grace's breath caught. Inside was a ring, not his mother's loose band that she still wore, but a new one, sized perfectly, with a small diamond that caught the light. "I had it made in town," Jonathan explained. "My mother's ring is yours to keep, but I wanted to give you something that was just ours, something I chose specifically for you." "Jonathan, it's beautiful." Grace's eyes stung with tears as he slipped it onto her finger beside the original band. It fit perfectly, the 2 rings nestling together like they'd been made as a pair. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a reason to buy it, for giving me a reason to hope again." He kissed her knuckles right above the rings. "For giving me back my life." The next weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Grace threw herself into planning with Mrs. Brennan's enthusiastic assistance, while Jonathan handled ranch business and slowly, deliberately courted his own wife. He brought her wildflowers from the fields, even though they were barely in bloom. He asked her about her day, really listening to the answers. He read with her in the evenings, their chairs drawn close, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence. The boys noticed and approved. Eli's wariness gradually transformed into cautious happiness, while Caleb announced to anyone who would listen that his mama and papa were in love, just like in the storybooks. "Is it true?" Eli asked Grace one evening, cornering her in the hallway. "You really love papa? This isn't just for show?" Grace knelt to his level, taking his hands. "It's completely true. I love your father very much, and I love you and Caleb more than I can express. This family we've built together, it's the most real thing in my life." "I was scared," Eli admitted, his voice small, "that you'd leave once you didn't need us anymore, that this was all temporary." "Oh, sweetheart," Grace pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'll never not need you. You're my son now, in every way that matters, and even when you're grown and gone off to build your own life, I'll still need you. That's what mothers do. They need their children forever." Eli clung to her, and Grace felt wetness against her neck. They stayed like that until his breathing steadied, until the fear had been talked through and soothed. When he pulled back, his eyes were red but clear. "Mama used to say love was a choice," he said, "that every day you choose to love someone. She was right. Your first mama was very wise. And you choose us? Every day?" "Every single day. Without hesitation." Eli nodded slowly, then surprised her with a genuine smile, the first fully unguarded one she'd seen from him. "I choose you too, as my mama, for real, not just because Papa said so." Grace's heart felt too large for her chest. "That means everything to me, Eli. Everything." The wedding was planned for late April, when spring had finally seized control from winter's grip and the ranch lands had transformed from brown and dormant to green and alive. Invitations went out to neighboring ranches, to the townspeople who'd proven themselves friends, to the few family members Jonathan had scattered across the territory. Grace's dress was made from cream silk, simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and sleeves that had belonged to Jonathan's mother. Mrs. Brennan had insisted on borrowing it from storage, saying it would tie the past and present together perfectly. "Something old," the housekeeper said, pinning the lace carefully, "from the first Mrs. Hale to the second, passing the torch, so to speak." Grace ran her fingers over the delicate fabric, thinking about the woman who'd worn it decades ago, who'd built the foundation that Grace now stood on. "I hope I can honor that legacy." "You already have, dear, just by being yourself." The days leading up to the wedding were chaotic but joyful. The house underwent a transformation, cleaned and decorated until it gleamed. The barn was cleared and decorated for the reception. Food was prepared, flowers were arranged, and everyone on the ranch pitched in with infectious enthusiasm. Jonathan and Grace saw less of each other as the date approached, a deliberate choice to make the wedding day itself more special. But they passed notes like teenagers, left small gifts for each other to find, and occasionally stole kisses when no one was watching. "I can't believe we're doing this," Grace said one evening, a week before the wedding, when they'd snuck away to the library for a few minutes alone. "Having a real wedding after we're already married. It's absurd." "It's perfect," Jonathan corrected, pulling her close. "We're doing everything backwards, remember? Why stop now? No regrets? About any of this?" "My only regret is that I didn't see you clearly from the start, that I wasted time being cold and distant when I could have been falling in love with you." His hand cupped her cheek. "But we have now. We have all the days ahead. That's what matters." The night before the wedding, Grace couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, looking out over the moonlit ranch, marveling at how much had changed in just a few months. She'd arrived here broken and desperate, accepting a marriage that promised nothing but survival. Now she stood on the eve of celebrating a love she'd never imagined, a family she'd never expected, a life that exceeded every dream. A soft knock at her door made her turn. "Come in." Eli and Caleb stood in the doorway in their nightshirts, looking uncertain. "We couldn't sleep," Eli said. "Tomorrow's the big day." "Nervous?" Grace asked, opening her arms. Both boys came to her and they stood together at the window looking out at their land. "A little," Eli admitted. "What if something goes wrong? Then we'll handle it together. That's what families do." Grace kissed the top of his head. "Tomorrow is going to be wonderful, I promise. A celebration of all of us, not just your father and me." "Papa says after tomorrow, nothing changes except everything's official," Caleb said, working through the concept. I don't really understand. It means we're already a family in our hearts. Tomorrow, we're just telling everyone else. Grace pulled them both closer. You two are my sons. That's already true. Tomorrow just makes it official in front of witnesses. Can we stay here tonight? Eli asked quietly. With you? Grace's throat tightened. Of course. Let's all pile in together, one last night before the big day. They climbed into her bed, one boy on each side, and Grace lay between them, feeling their warmth, their trust, their love. These children who'd been strangers mere months ago now held her heart completely. She told them stories until Caleb's breathing deepened into sleep, and Eli's eyelids grew heavy. Mama, Eli whispered, fighting sleep. I'm glad you came here. Even though it was scary and hard, I'm glad you stayed. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. She stayed awake long after both boys slept, memorizing this moment, storing it away. Tomorrow would be grand and public, but tonight was intimate and perfect, just a mother and her sons together in the quiet dark. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring morning that promised good things. Grace was whisked away by Mrs. Brennan and a gaggle of women from town, all determined to make her presentable. She was bathed, dressed, her hair arranged in a style that was elegant but not too formal. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back was confident, loved, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the dress or the hairstyle and everything to do with the joy radiating from within. You look like a bride, Mrs. Brennan said, dabbing at her eyes. A real bride, marrying for love. That's how it should be. Thank you, Grace said, hugging the older woman. For everything, for believing in us when this all seemed impossible. I saw what you were from the start, dear. The master just needed time to catch up. The ceremony was held outside, in the meadow behind the house where wildflowers had begun to bloom. Chairs were arranged in rows, and the entire community seemed to have turned out, ranch hands in their Sunday best, families from neighboring spreads, townspeople who'd come to witness this unlikely love story. Grace waited in the house, her heart pounding, while guests assembled. She could hear music starting, voices rising in conversation. Then Mrs. Brennan was there, saying it was time, and Grace was walking through the house and out the back door. Jonathan stood at the end of a makeshift aisle, flanked by Charlie on one side and his two sons on the other. He wore a dark suit, his hair carefully combed, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Grace's breath catch. Pure love, pure joy, pure certainty, everything she'd never expected to see directed at her. The walk down the aisle felt both eternal and instant. Then she was there, taking Jonathan's hands, while the minister began to speak words about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. We're gathered here today, the minister said, to witness and celebrate the union of Jonathan Hale and Grace Whitfield Hale. Now, I understand this is somewhat unusual, as these two are already legally married. But today is about something deeper than legality. It's about choice, about standing before family and friends and choosing each other, freely and joyfully. Grace looked into Jonathan's eyes and saw her own feelings reflected back. This was right. This was real. This was everything. Jonathan, the minister continued, do you take Grace as your wife, not from necessity but from love? Do you promise to cherish her, to stand beside her, to build a life together based on respect and affection? I do, Jonathan said, his voice strong and clear. I choose Grace today and every day. I promise to love her, to honor her, to be the husband she deserves. And Grace, do you take Jonathan as your husband, freely choosing this life, this family, this love? Do you promise to stand beside him, to build your future together as true partners? Grace felt tears spilling over, but her voice didn't waver. I do. I choose Jonathan, choose this family, choose this life we're building. I promise to love him always, to be his true partner in everything. The rings? Eli stepped forward, holding a small pillow on which sat two new bands, matching gold rings to replace the hurried choices of their first wedding. Jonathan took one and slipped it onto Grace's finger beside the engagement ring he'd given her. With this ring, I thee wed. Not because I need you, but because I love you. Grace took the second ring and placed it on Jonathan's finger, her hands trembling slightly. With this ring I thee wed, because you've given me everything I never knew I needed: love, family, home. Then by the power vested in me and in the presence of these witnesses, I declare you husband and wife. Again. The minister smiled. Jonathan, you may kiss your bride. Like you mean it this time. Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Jonathan grinned, a real, unguarded, joyful grin that transformed his whole face. He pulled Grace close and kissed her thoroughly, while their guests cheered and the boys whooped and misses. Brennan sobbed happily into her handkerchief. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, the minister raised his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Hale. May their love continue to grow, and may their family prosper. More cheers. Then Caleb was hugging Grace's legs, and Eli was trying to look mature, but failing as he grinned, and people were surging forward with congratulations. Grace held Jonathan's hand through it all, anchored by his presence, by the solid reality of this love they'd built. The reception in the barn was everything Grace hadn't known she wanted. Tables laden with food, music provided by ranch hands with fiddles and guitars, dancing and laughter and joy filling every corner. She danced with Jonathan first, a slow waltz that let them simply hold each other and marvel at what they'd accomplished. Happy? He murmured against her ear. Happier than I've ever been. You? Complete. For the first time in 3 years, I feel complete. They danced with others too. Grace with Charlie, who pronounced her the best thing that ever happened to the ranch, and with Eli, who was beginning to grow tall and gangly. Jonathan danced with Mrs. Brennan, who cried through the entire song, and with a giggling Caleb, who stood on his father's feet and let himself be spun around. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in spectacular colors, Jonathan pulled Grace aside. Come with me. I have something to show you. He led her away from the celebration, down a path toward the eastern pasture. There, overlooking the valley, stood a small structure Grace had never noticed before. A gazebo, newly built, with climbing roses already planted around its base. I had the men build it, Jonathan explained. A place just for us. Somewhere we can come when the house gets too loud, when we need to remember why we chose this. Jonathan, it's beautiful. There's more. He pulled her inside, where a bench ran along one wall. On the opposite wall, words had been carved into the wood. Grace stepped closer to read them. Here stands Grace, who came in winter and brought spring, who accepted shelter and gave home, who married from need and loved from choice. Forever our heart, forever our family. Grace's vision blurred with tears. You wrote this? I wanted you to know how I see you, not as the desperate woman who arrived at my gates, but as the incredible woman you've always been, the one who saved us all. Jonathan wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. I love you, Grace. Not because I need to, because I choose to, every day, for the rest of my life. I love you too, Grace whispered. So much it terrifies me sometimes. Love should be a little terrifying. It means you're brave enough to give someone your whole heart. He turned her to face him. Thank you for being that brave, for staying when you could have left, for fighting for us when it would have been easier to give up. They stood together as twilight deepened, holding each other while music and laughter drifted up from the barn below. This was their moment, their truth, their beginning, not of a marriage, which they'd already had, but of a real partnership built on love and choice and unwavering commitment. Eventually, they made their way back to the celebration, where they were immediately swept up in more dancing, more congratulations, more joy. The party continued late into the night, and by the time the last guest departed, Grace was exhausted but happier than she'd thought possible. The boys had long since been carried to bed by Mrs. Brennan, leaving Jonathan and Grace alone to survey the remnants of their celebration. Paper lanterns still glowed softly, flower petals littered the ground. The barn stood open, still decorated, still beautiful. We did it, Grace said, leaning against Jonathan. We actually did it. We did. Built a family, found love, survived everything that tried to break us. He kissed her temple. Ready for the rest of our lives? With you? Absolutely. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and for the first time Grace entered through the front door as the true mistress of Hale Ranch, beloved wife and chosen partner. Jonathan led her upstairs to the master bedroom, their bedroom now, the one they'd transformed together from a shrine to the past into a home for their future. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hale," Jonathan said softly. "I've been home since the day I arrived," Grace replied. "I just didn't know it yet." The months that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of family life. Grace officially adopted the boys, a legal ceremony that made Caleb bounce with excitement and brought tears to Eli's eyes. She opened a small school in the ranch's unused wing, teaching not just her sons but children from neighboring farms, finally able to pursue her calling on her own terms. Jonathan slowly let go of the last vestiges of his grief, allowing himself to be fully present in this new life. He laughed more, smiled more, showed affection freely instead of hoarding it like a scarce resource. The ranch prospered under his management, but more importantly, his family thrived. Summer brought long days of sunshine and the kind of contentment Grace had never imagined. She and Jonathan would sit on the porch after the boys were asleep, hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing, plans for the future, memories of the past, the thousand small joys of daily life. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Jonathan asked one evening. "When Charlie brought you to my study, half frozen and desperate." "Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago." "I thought you were trouble," Jonathan admitted. "Too educated, too proud, too likely to disrupt everything. I almost turned you away." "Why didn't you?" "Something in your eyes. You were terrified, but you weren't broken. You'd fight to survive, I could see that. And I thought, here's someone as stubborn as I am. Maybe that's what we need." He pulled her closer. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to stay. Best decision I ever made was saying yes." By autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, Grace looked around at her life and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. She'd come to this ranch with nothing but a carpetbag and a prayer, accepting a loveless arrangement because the alternative was death. Now she had everything: a husband who adored her, sons who called her mama without hesitation, a home that was truly hers, a purpose that fulfilled her. The first anniversary of their legal marriage came and went, unmarked by any official recognition because it no longer mattered. What mattered was the anniversary of the real wedding, which they planned to celebrate every year with the same joy and intentionality. One evening in late October, Grace gathered the family in the library. She had news she'd been holding close for a few weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I have something to tell you all," she said, perched on the arm of Jonathan's chair while the boys sprawled on the rug. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "Are we getting a puppy?" "I've been asking forever." "Not a puppy," Grace interrupted gently. "Something else, someone else, actually. Next spring, you're going to have a baby brother or sister." The silence lasted only a heartbeat before chaos erupted. Caleb whooped and did a complete somersault. Eli's eyes went huge, his mouth falling open. And Jonathan looked at Grace with an expression that held joy and terror and wonder all at once. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "Very sure. I saw the doctor yesterday. He confirms it. We're having a baby." "A baby?" Jonathan repeated as if testing the words. Then he pulled Grace down into his lap, holding her tight. "We're having a baby." "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" Caleb demanded. "I want a brother." "I want a sister," Eli countered. "We already have enough boys." Grace laughed, running her hands over their heads. "We won't know for months yet, but either way, this baby will be lucky to have you two as big brothers." Later, after the boys had finally calmed enough to be put to bed, Jonathan and Grace lay together in their room, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I'm terrified," he admitted quietly. "After what happened with Sarah, I know. But Jonathan, I'm strong and healthy, and I have an excellent doctor. We'll be careful, do everything right. This baby is going to be fine. We're going to be fine. Promise me. Promise me you'll be all right." Grace took his face in her hands. "I can't promise that because life doesn't work that way. But I can promise I'll fight with everything I have to come back to you and our boys. That I'm not going anywhere if I can help it. That'll have to be enough." He kissed her softly. "This baby, he or she is going to be so loved, so wanted, built from love, not just necessity. The way all children should be. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, each month bringing new changes and new preparations. The nursery was opened and refreshed, the boys argued cheerfully about names, and the entire household buzzed with anticipation. Grace continued teaching until she got too large to move comfortably, then transitioned to tutoring from a comfortable chair while her students worked around her. Jonathan was attentive to the point of being overprotective, hovering until Grace finally had to sit him down and explain that she needed to maintain some independence or she'd go mad. He backed off slightly, but never stopped watching her with that mixture of love and worry. Winter came again, bringing memories of the previous year, Grace's arrival, the desperate bargain, the uncertain beginning. But this winter was warm with family and anticipation, nothing like that bleak season of survival. "It's hard to believe it's only been a year," Grace said one snowy evening, watching Eli help Caleb with his reading. "Feels like we've been a family forever." "That's because we were meant to be," Jonathan said simply. "Just took us a while to find each other." In early April, as the world began to wake from winter once again, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Jonathan's fear was palpable, when he held her hand and whispered desperate prayers. But Grace was strong, and when the sun rose on a new spring morning, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that announced her displeasure at the whole process. "A girl," the doctor announced, placing the tiny, red-faced bundle in Grace's arms. "Healthy and mad about it. Congratulations." Grace looked down at her daughter, their daughter, and felt her heart expand impossibly. This child, born from love, wanted by everyone in this family, already surrounded by so much joy. "She's perfect," she whispered. Jonathan sat beside her on the bed, one arm around Grace, one finger gently touching his daughter's tiny hand. When the baby's fingers closed around his, he made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "She really is. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this gift." "We did it together," Grace reminded him. "Everything we do is together now." The boys were allowed in shortly after, tiptoeing like they were approaching something sacred. Caleb's eyes went round as saucers. "She's so tiny and red." "She's beautiful," Eli said firmly, and Grace heard the protectiveness already entering his voice. This was his sister, and he would guard her fiercely. "Would you like to hold her?" Grace asked. She helped Eli settle into a chair and carefully place the baby in his arms. He cradled her like she was made of glass, his young face solemn with responsibility. "Hi, little sister. I'm Eli. I'm going to teach you everything important." "Not before I do," Caleb protested. "I'm going to teach her about horses." "You can both teach her," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'll need both her big brothers." They named her Sarah Joy, Sarah for the mother the boys had lost. Joy for the emotion she brought into their lives. It was a bridge between past and present, honoring what came before while celebrating what was now. The ranch celebrated the birth with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for the wedding. Neighbors brought gifts and food. The hands treated cigars around. Mrs. Brennan cried and fussed and declared herself too old for all this emotion. And through it all, Grace and Jonathan marveled at what they'd built. A family. A real, complicated, messy, beautiful family. One evening, when Sarah was a few weeks old and Grace had recovered enough to move around comfortably, she stood in the doorway of the nursery watching Jonathan rock their daughter. He was singing softly, some half-remembered lullaby, and the tenderness in his face made Grace's throat tight. He looked up and caught her watching. "What are you thinking?" "That I love you, that I'm grateful, that this life we've built, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." "Come here," Jonathan said softly. Grace crossed to them, settling beside the rocking chair. Jonathan shifted Sarah so Grace could see her sleeping face, peaceful and perfect. "A year and a half ago, I was a dead man walking," Jonathan said quietly. "Going through the motions, pretending to be alive. Then you came stumbling through a snowstorm, desperate and proud and refusing to give up. You changed everything, Grace. Brought me back to life. Gave my sons a mother. Made this house a home again. You did the same for me. Gave me shelter when I had none. Family when I was alone. Love when I'd given up hope. We saved each other," Jonathan said. "That's what makes this work. Not one rescuing the other, but both of us choosing to build something new together. Sarah stirred in his arms, making the little squeaking sounds that meant she'd wake soon and demand to be fed. Grace took her, settling into the rocking chair herself, and Jonathan knelt beside them. "This is my family," he said, wonder in his voice. "My whole world, right here in this room." "Our family," Grace corrected gently. "Our world, built from nothing, sustained by choice." They sat together in the soft lamplight, parents and child, while outside the ranch settled into evening quiet. Down the hall, two boys slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. Throughout the house, evidence of family life, toys on floors, books left open, dishes from dinner, proved that this space was lived in, cherished, real. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. Droughts that tested the ranch's resources. Illnesses that frightened but didn't destroy. The normal struggles of raising children and maintaining a marriage and building a life in unforgiving country. But they faced everything together, as the partnership they'd promised to be. Eli grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament, but with Grace's love of learning. He devoured books and asked endless questions, and eventually left for college back east, though he returned every summer to help with the ranch. Caleb remained sunny and energetic, more interested in horses and cattle than academics, but with a gift for connecting with animals that served him well. He took over more and more of the ranch operations as the years passed, working alongside Jonathan until it became unclear who was actually running things. Sarah grew up adored by her entire family, intelligent and stubborn, and completely sure of her place in the world. She learned from both Grace's example and Sarah's memory, becoming a young woman who honored the past while embracing her own future. More children came, 2 more sons and another daughter, filling the house with noise and chaos and love. The ranch prospered. Grace's school expanded. And through it all, Jonathan and Grace remained partners, lovers, best friends, choosing each other daily the way Sarah had once told Eli love required. On their 10th wedding anniversary, the real one, the one that counted, they returned to the gazebo Jonathan had built all those years ago. The roses had grown wild and beautiful, covering the structure in blooms. They sat together on the bench, older now but no less devoted, and looked out over the valley that had become their whole world. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Taking a chance on a desperate stranger?" "Not once." "You?" "Never. Best bargain I ever struck." Jonathan laughed and pulled her close. "It stopped being a bargain years ago, Grace. Now it's just love." "Just love," Grace repeated, tasting the words. "As if love is ever simple." "It is with you. Complicated in the details maybe, but simple in the fundamentals. I love you. You love me. We built this together. That's as simple as it gets." Grace leaned into him, watching the sunset paint their land in gold and rose. From the house came the sounds of their children, their numerous, loud, wonderful children, and the voices of ranch hands finishing the day's work, and Mrs. Brennan's call that dinner would be ready soon. This was her life now. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd imagined in her desperate walk through that long-ago snowstorm. Something better. Something richer. Something built from necessity but sustained by choice, from desperation but strengthened by love. "Ready to head back?" Jonathan asked eventually. "The mob will be wanting their dinner." "In a minute." Grace turned to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "I just want to remember this moment. Us, here, with everything we've built spread out before us. We have a lifetime of moments ahead. I know, and I intend to treasure every single one." They walked back to the house hand in hand as stars began to emerge overhead, 2 people who'd started as strangers and become everything to each other. Behind them, the gazebo stood as testament to their journey, from winter to spring, from need to love, from a desperate bargain to a life beyond imagining. Grace had come to Hale Ranch seeking shelter and found a home. She'd accepted a practical arrangement and received a love story. She'd married a man who needed a mother for his sons and became partner to his heart, keeper of his joy, builder of his future. And every day, every single day, she chose it all again. Because love, as Sarah had once said, was a choice. And Grace chose Jonathan, chose their children, chose this life they'd built from nothing. She chose and chose and chose again. And that, in the end, was what made everything real.